The wind whipped across the open courtyard of Winterfell, carrying the bitter chill of the encroaching endless night. Daenerys Targaryen stood upon the battlements, her fur-lined cloak snapping behind her. She had grown more accustomed to the North's frigid bite in recent days, yet this cold felt different, an invasive, unnatural chill that sank into her bones no matter how close she stood to the flames. Even though she was ringed by braziers flaring with dancing orange light, it seemed her very soul was touched by a creeping frost. The threat of the Night King loomed beyond the horizon, and with each day of uneasy calm, the tension frayed at the nerves of the living. It was not fear that gnawed at Daenerys, or at least that was what she told herself. It was the uncertainty, the knowledge that a dark power stood poised to devour everything she had fought so hard to protect. She sensed a stirring on the ramparts as Jon Snow walked up behind her. She did not need to glance over her shoulder to know the weight of his gaze. His footsteps were soft, hesitant. He was always mindful of her presence, yet something about him now spoke of a deeper worry. Silence stretched between them while the winter wind whispered secrets. Daenerys finally turned her head, meeting Jon's eyes in the torchlight. They both wore the marks of battle and heartbreak, a lingering sorrow for the allies lost, the friends cut down in the war against Cersei, and now the renewed worry over a battle with an enemy far more fearsome than any mortal army. He spoke quietly. Tormund has spotted something beyond the wall. They're moving again. The lines around his eyes deepened, revealing the dread he fought to contain. Daenerys had learned to read his face, the smallest quirk of an eyebrow or twitch at the corner of his mouth. She saw his devotion to their cause, to their people, but also the uncertainty about what was coming. They were no longer just battling for a crown or for vengeance against those who had wronged them. This was a war for life itself. She set her jaw, nodding in acknowledgement, a hardness settling into her features. In the courtyard below, soldiers carried barrels of oil for the catapults, hammered new weapons on makeshift anvils, and sharpened swords until they glinted in the torchlight. The battered ranks of the Unsullied and the Northmen had to be replenished with untested recruits, many of them barely older than boys. The Dothraki patrolled restlessly, their savage instincts ill at ease so far from sun-scorched plains. Yet Daenerys knew that if any group in the world could adapt to these dire circumstances, it was the Dothraki. They might have scorned the stone walls and the cold, but they respected power and skill in battle. And every living soul here, man or woman, free or formerly enslaved, foreigner or northerner, had one shared cause: to face the Night King when he emerged from the darkness. She found her gaze drifting beyond the walls to where Rhaegal and Drogon roost, perched near the castle's southwestern tower. Their tails flicked in agitation, a sure sign they sensed the stirring of something unnatural. The dragons, so attuned to magic, had become sullen of late, especially Drogon, who roared with a fury that Daenerys tried to calm. She had flown them in small circles above the land, scanning for any sign of the dead moving south, but always returning without conclusive proof. Yet the rumors were constant. The wildlings who came to Winterfell spoke of bone-white figures in the night, entire villages left silent, and fresh footprints on virgin snow. The Night King had been seen once. Tormund and Gendry had glimpsed him, a distant silhouette of a rider with glowing blue eyes, silent among his deathly retinue. Since then, ravens carried frantic reports of the dead marching in columns across a frozen wasteland. It was as though the Great War had not ended at the Battle of Winterfell but had merely paused. The living had taken a breath, believing victory was at hand. Yet the real horror was only now unfolding. Daenerys leaned on the crenellation, mind racing. She and Jon had achieved so much, overcome so many betrayals and heartbreaks. The crown in King's Landing, shattered by the war, lay as worthless as the ashes in which it burned. She had focused her energy on unifying the living, forging alliances with the North despite old resentments. After all, what was a throne or a kingdom if there was no one alive to rule or be ruled? For all her ambition and the unyielding desire to claim her birthright, Daenerys saw a higher calling now. She was the breaker of chains, mother of dragons, and soon, perhaps, she would be the bringer of dawn, if she could only protect these lands from the Night King's final assault. Jon studied her profile in the flicker of torchlight. He respected her convictions. It was her fire that had drawn him to her, though that same fire sometimes burned too hot for the cautious northerners to fully trust. He reached out a hand, hesitating before resting it lightly on her shoulder. "We need to prepare," he said. "If Tormund's right, there will be a decisive engagement sooner than we expected. Then we make our stand here," Daenerys replied firmly, in a voice that brokered no dissent. Her breath misted, and her silver-white hair glowed eerily in the reflected torchlight. "We cannot give them more ground. Winterfell is as far as they'll come." Jon gave a taut nod, pressing his lips together. Part of him wondered if it might not be better to lure the dead further south, to flatter terrain where the dragon's advantage would be uncontested. Yet, he understood the strategic significance of Winterfell, a rallying point, a fortress that was cherished by the North. Retreating from Winterfell would crush morale. People needed a symbol, and Winterfell stood tall as one. "Then we hold Winterfell," Jon said quietly, stepping away to leave Daenerys to her thoughts. She watched him stride off into the gloom. Behind her, the sky above the ramparts was clouded, the moon a wan, pale orb that did little to fight off the darkness. The last time the Night King had attacked, it had been chaos, unspeakable horrors, an onslaught that nearly broke their lines. Only the bravery of countless men and women, the sacrifice of heroes, and the combined might of her dragons had stayed the tide. But so many had fallen, and now the living's forces were stretched perilously thin. Daenerys drew in a slow breath of cold air and moved off the battlements. She made her way to the courtyard, where Grey Worm waited solemn and steady as ever. He placed a fist to his chest in salute. "My queen," he said, voice clipped and formal. He reported the day's training with the new recruits, the state of the fortifications, and the general readiness of the Unsullied. His words conveyed that, though these measures were formidable, no defense could guarantee safety against an enemy that could raise the dead from their very ranks. She nodded after each report, her mind already evaluating. With the arrival of each hour, more men and women came seeking refuge, swelling Winterfell's population, stretching resources. Everyone who could wield a blade was pressed into service. The rest were assigned to carry supplies, tend to the wounded, or keep the fires burning. The living must remain vigilant, or so Davos had warned time and again, for a single lapse could bring utter devastation. Before she could say more, a roar from Drogon cut across the night, echoing against the stone walls. Daenerys and Grey Worm exchanged glances. The dragon sounded agitated, an uncharacteristic cry even for Drogon, who was prone to temper. Daenerys immediately set off, cloak trailing behind her, Grey Worm following at a respectful distance. She felt a stirring in her mind, a bond that existed between her and her children. Her dragons were not simple beasts. They were living manifestations of her family's ancient power. If Drogon was uneasy, it could only mean something unnatural was amiss. Sure enough, as she neared the southwestern tower, she saw her dragon perched on a broad patch of ground cleared of rubble. His black scales shimmered under the weak moonlight, ridges of bone rising along his spine as he hissed at the night sky. Regal, the green dragon, circled overhead, letting out a piercing keen. A swirl of cold wind whipped around Daenerys, yet the warmth of the dragon's presence comforted her. She advanced slowly, murmuring soft words in High Valyrian. Drogon's eyes burned bright, as though he sensed a threat that lay beyond human understanding. Daenerys raised a hand, letting Drogon nuzzle it with surprising tenderness. She could feel his heat, smell the acrid sulfur of his breath. Beneath her calm facade, her heart pounded. She had no illusions. If Drogon ever turned on her, her life would end in a single breath of flame. Yet there was trust between them, a deep bond that had been forged from the moment these creatures hatched and she emerged unburnt. "What troubles you, my child?" she whispered, though she expected no answer. A shiver coursed through her again, and she turned to see Grey Worm scanning the shadows, a hand on the hilt of his spear. There was nothing visible, only the swirling snow drifting lazily in the wind. yet it felt as if eyes were upon them, watchful and malevolent. Daenerys patted Drogon's flank, then lifted her head to the sky. Rhaegal hovered, letting out another angry shriek. She thought of Viserion, lost to the Night King's spear, turned into an undead abomination that had shattered the wall. She had not been able to save him then, and the memory stung like a reopened wound. Fighting back the creeping dread, Daenerys looked to Grey Worm. "Double the watch," she commanded. "Have archers on the walls at all times. I do not want to be caught unawares." Grey Worm bowed and departed to fulfill her order. She lingered a moment longer with Drogon and Rhaegal, running her hand along Drogon's neck, feeling his heartbeat. She spoke softly to him, urging calm, before she turned to head back toward the keep. Her mind was plagued by a sense of foreboding, the feeling that something was already reaching out, brushing against the edges of her consciousness like a faint breath of wind in the dark. That night, Daenerys found it difficult to sleep. Though her bedchamber in Winterfell was warm by northern standards, her dreams were filled with cold. She saw the Night King, standing atop an icy ridge, a silent legion of the dead at his back. He lifted one withered finger and pointed directly at her. In her dream, she felt an unnatural chill pulse through her body. She tried to call out, to rally her dragons, but found no voice. Helplessness and dread made her heart thunder in her chest. She woke with a start, covered in a cold sweat, moonlight painting the walls silver. For a moment, she strained her ears, half expecting to hear the war horn signaling an invasion, but the night was still, too still. She rose, pulling her cloak around her shoulders, and paced across the cold stones of the room. Dreams had always been important to her. She remembered the House of the Undying in Karth, where visions had shown her fragments of past, present, and future. She remembered the flickering images of a throne room with a collapsed roof, snow drifting through the air, her steps across broken tiles. She remembered the whisper of dragons. Although time had worn away the sharpness of those visions, the sense of prophecy weighed upon her, as though an unseen tapestry was being woven by the threads of fate. Unable to quell her restlessness, she left the chamber. The corridors of Winterfell were dark, lit only by occasional torches set in iron sconces, casting flickering shadows on the walls. As she passed by the great hall, she saw Tyrion Lannister seated at one of the long tables, bent over a map, a lantern beside him. His presence was not unexpected. The hand of the queen rarely slept when there was pressing business. She paused, noticing the weariness in his shoulders. He had lost so much, endured scorn from his own family, yet he still strove to protect the living. She approached softly. He glanced up, his mismatched eyes reflecting the candlelight. "Your Grace," he murmured, offering a small, polite bow of his head. She came forward, resting a hand on the edge of the table. She could see the tactical layout he had been studying. A map of the North with figurines representing their troops, fortifications, and supply lines. Daenerys saw that he had drawn markings where the scouts had spotted movement. It was scattered, as though the dead army was spread wide, feeling for weaknesses. "Can't sleep?" she asked, though it was more a statement of fact. Tyrion sighed, picking up a cup of wine nearby and swirling the dregs. "Sleep is for those who don't have the fate of the world on their shoulders," he quipped softly, though there was little humor in his tone. "I'd offer you some wine, but I suspect we both need clear heads in the days to come." Daenerys nodded, glancing over the map. Her vision swam with possibilities. Where would the Night King strike? Would it be a direct assault, or a cunning feint to draw out their dragons and forces? "I had a dream," she said quietly, not meeting Tyrion's eyes. She seldom spoke of her dreams. A dream of him. Tyrion set the cup down, giving her his full attention. She sensed his hesitation. The notion of prophetic dreams unsettled him, as it did many rational minds. But he remained silent, allowing her to share if she chose. She closed her eyes briefly, recalling the vividness of it. "He pointed at me, and I felt like something was slipping away inside me, as though my will was being smothered by ice." Her voice faltered. "I'm not afraid for myself, Tyrion. But if he has grown more powerful, if he can strike at us in ways we do not understand." Tyrion's gaze flicked across her face. Though he had his doubts about omens, he respected her instincts. "Perhaps the dream was only a manifestation of your fears," he offered gently. "But we must remain open to all possibilities. You, above all, have encountered magic beyond what most in Westeros can fathom. If the Night King possesses more than the power to raise the dead, well, it is a grim thought." Daenerys opened her eyes and placed a hand on his shoulder, feeling the rough texture of his coat beneath her palm. "We will face whatever comes," she said, her voice quieter now. "But we cannot face it alone. We need a plan, or we will be dancing in the dark while he chooses the battleground." Tyrion nodded, turning to the map again. "Yes, a plan. We've reinforced the outer walls, stationed watchers along the battlements, and gathered every scrap of dragonglass we could find. Samwell Tarly is studying old texts in the library. If there is a hidden secret to the Night King's power, perhaps he'll find it. Meanwhile, you and Jon might consider employing the dragons in a more surgical fashion, if we can pinpoint the Night King's location. A direct strike might be the difference between victory and defeat." She pursed her lips at that. "He may be expecting it. He knows the dragons are our greatest weapons." Briefly, she thought of Viserion once more, how easily the Night King had felled him. "I won't risk Drogon and Rhaegal needlessly." She paused, then added, "But if we see a chance, we must take it. I will end him myself if I can." A rueful smile tugged at Tyrion's mouth. "Spoken like the Daenerys I know. I only hope the opportunity arises, and that when it does, we are prepared." The two fell silent, and after a moment, Daenerys moved away, leaving Tyrion to his solitary counsel. The next day dawned gray and bitterly cold. Overcast skies sealed away the sunlight. Daenerys roused herself early, determined to test her dragons and keep them accustomed to flight. She went to the courtyard, where a handful of Unsullied stood at attention, their breath misting in the morning air. Jon was there, speaking quietly with Davos Seaworth. At the sight of her, he inclined his head in greeting. She summoned Drogon and Rhaegal with a series of whistles, each dragon lumbering forward out of the gloom. Their immense bodies moved with powerful grace, and their presence commanded the attention of everyone in the courtyard. Daenerys climbed onto Drogon's back, settling into the saddle with practiced ease. The beast rumbled deep in his throat, as though acknowledging her. She gestured for Jon to take Rhaegal, something that had become routine ever since Jon had discovered the dragons would let him ride. Though he still seemed slightly in awe whenever he mounted the green dragon, Daenerys could see his confidence growing with each flight. Soon, both riders lifted into the air, the dragon's wings buffeting the stones below. They soared beyond Winterfell's walls, making slow circles around the fortress. Daenerys scanned the world below. Even from this vantage, the northern landscape looked bleak. Patches of ice, bare trees, and rolling hills of snow. She saw the small columns of refugees trudging along, heading for Winterfell, escorted by a few weary guards. As they flew, a grim realization settled on her heart. This land was on the brink of a final stand. The war was truly upon them. Over the next hour, Daenerys guided Drogon further afield, Jon by her side. They did not spot any large gathering of the dead, but in the distance, Daenerys thought she saw something moving beneath the snow-laden branches of a forest. A shape that vanished almost as soon as she noticed it, leaving only tracks. They circled once, but neither of them could confirm what they had seen. The morning light grew no warmer. If anything, the chill deepened. On the return flight, Daenerys and Jon landed the dragons atop a ridge overlooking Winterfell. They dismounted and let the creatures rest, content to watch the fortress from a distance. The vantage point reminded Daenerys of the day she had arrived in the north, the day she first saw Winterfell's walls rising from the stark, frozen land. Now, she stood here with Jon, pondering a future in which the Night King might shatter everything they cared for. Daenerys turned to Jon, her expression resolute. "We cannot wait for him to come to us again," she declared. slipping down the slope a few steps, boots crunching in the snow. We must consider a preemptive strike. Jon rubbed his gloved hands together, breath steaming in the cold air. We tried that once, beyond the wall, but we nearly lost everything, he reminded her gently. She saw the memory in his eyes. The frantic battle on the frozen lake, Viserion's death. We must be smarter this time. We do have more knowledge now, Daenerys countered, letting her gaze sweep the horizon. The living have grown wiser to his tactics. Perhaps with the help of Bran's visions or Sam's research, there has to be something we can exploit. Jon's mouth tightened. The mention of Bran's visions was a reminder of how strange the nature of this war could be. The three-eyed raven's power allowed Bran to see the past, sometimes glimpses of the future. We can speak to Bran when we return, Jon agreed. But we must remain cautious. We're dealing with a being that has existed for thousands of years. He's had time to plan his every step. They stood there in silence, the wind cutting across their cloaks. Around them, the dragons snorted impatiently, sending plumes of hot breath into the frigid air. Finally, Daenerys turned away, beckoning Drogon to kneel so she could remount. "Let us go back," she said, her resolve steeled. "We'll speak with Bran. Every moment we wait could be a moment he uses against us." By midday, they were in the God's Wood of Winterfell, a quiet space where Bran often sat in his wheelchair beneath the ancient weirwood tree, the red leaves rustling overhead like a silent chorus. The carved face on the trunk seemed to watch them as they approached. Bran lifted his gaze, pale and distant. Sometimes, Daenerys thought his eyes were those of a stranger, neither the sweet boy that once climbed these walls nor entirely the mystic presence of the three-eyed raven. He was something in between, something beyond simple labels. Jon knelt beside the younger man's chair, speaking in hushed tones. Daenerys stood a little ways back, arms folded, scanning Bran's face, searching for any flicker of humanity. Sometimes he would recall personal details, but often his voice was eerie and calm, as though he were reciting knowledge from a vast reservoir of memory. When Jon finished, Bran's gaze fixed on Daenerys, and she felt a slight chill, as though he was peering into her very essence. "The Night King moves in shadows we cannot fully see," Bran intoned softly. "He understands that you and Jon Snow are his greatest threats, more than your armies or the North's defenses. He knows the dragons are powerful. He wants to remove the greatest threat by subverting it." His voice was monotone, reminiscent of the wind sighing through the leaves. Daenerys frowned, stepping closer. "Subvert the threat?" she repeated. "He already took Viserion from me. Does he seek to slay Drogon and Rhaegal as well?" Bran blinked, his distant expression unchanging. "He desires dominion over all life, not merely destruction. He uses the cold to corrupt, to shatter the bonds that hold us together, and replace them with his own will." He paused, and for a moment, a flicker of sadness crossed his features. "He tried to reach me before in my visions. His presence is always searching, a cold that seeps into the mind." Jon's hand tightened on the arm of Bran's chair. "But how can we stop him from doing so? If he can break into your visions, perhaps he can do so to others." Daenerys has felt unsettled. At that admission, Daenerys felt a flash of vulnerability. She had not meant for Jon to share her unease, but now it was out in the open. Bran regarded her once again, and she braced herself. "The Night King has grown bolder," Bran said. "He reached out once in the form of a dream. He tested your mind, the edges of your spirit. The bond with your dragons is strong, and he might see that as a gateway." Daenerys's heartbeat quickened. "A gateway?" she repeated, her voice low and urgent. "What do you mean?" "Your dragons are living magic, tied to the Targaryen bloodline. The Night King's magic is a twisted reflection of the same ancient powers, shaped by the children of the forest long ago. If he can corrupt the bond, he can turn it against you." Hearing these words, Daenerys felt a pang of horror. The notion that the Night King could infiltrate her connection to Drogon and Rhaegal, the same way he had claimed Viserion's corpse, was almost unbearable. She took a steadying breath. How do we prevent that? Bran's expression became distant again. Dragonglass and Valyrian steel can wound him physically, but to fight his corruption of the mind or spirit, you must guard yourself. Resolve alone may not be enough. The old lore says there are places of power, wards that can be established. But we have little time, and the knowledge is incomplete. Jon rose, eyes on Daenerys. We'll strengthen the wards in Winterfell with runes carved into the walls, the gates, wherever possible. We'll ensure every soldier has dragonglass. But if the Night King's power extends beyond the battlefield, we have to consider the possibility that he might not face us in a straightforward assault. He might focus on Daenerys, on her dragons. Daenerys exhaled slowly. Then we must be ready, she said, her chin lifting in defiance. I won't cower in a locked tower. I will face him, and if his magic tries to claim me, I will fight it with everything I have. Even Bran's voice carried a note of warning. Be careful, Daenerys Stormborn. The Night King's corruption is subtle. He won't come with a grand flourish. He will slip in like a silent frost, creeping through a crack in your resolve. He may prey upon your fears, your losses. For an instant, Bran's pale eyes flickered, and Daenerys sensed the presence of the old gods or something older still. He hungers for your soul, for the fire in your blood. The longer you fight, the more cunning he will become. The warning hung in the air. Daenerys felt her heart pound with renewed intensity. Yet she refused to let fear rule her. She was Daenerys Targaryen, the blood of old Valyria. She had walked through fire, birthed dragons, and freed countless souls from slavery. She would not yield to a creature of ice and death. So she told herself. Yet a gnawing doubt took root in her mind. For even the bravest heart can falter when faced with unimaginable power. They left Bran to his silent communion with the weirwood. Outside the Godswood, the hustle and bustle of Winterfell resumed. The courtyard busy with sparring soldiers, stable hands rushing to and fro, and the ever-present clang of the blacksmith's hammer. The day pressed on, each hour bringing new reports of distant sightings of whites. Daenerys summoned her council, Tyrion, Davos, Grey Worm, and a handful of northern lords, to discuss the next steps. They resolved to fortify the keep with additional runes and symbols gleaned from the rare texts Sam had unearthed, wards that might hinder the Night King's entry. Sam spoke in careful, measured tones, showing them crude sketches from an ancient manuscript. These symbols were believed to repel the influence of the others, he explained. Not sure how effective they'll be in practice, but every bit of help might count. They assigned teams to begin inscribing these wards along Winterfell's walls, using mixtures of dragonglass dust and paint. Throughout the day, Daenerys felt an odd pull on her mind, like a faint echo calling her name through a long hallway. She ignored it, focusing on the present. Yet no matter how she tried to concentrate, a cold whisper lingered, like the memory of a nightmare that refused to fade in the daylight. When she found a moment alone, she would shake her head and murmur to herself, forcing the chill away. She suspected the Night King was testing her, trying to probe her defenses. If that was the case, she refused to give him any purchase. Night fell once more, and Winterfell's courtyard blazed with torches. Watchfires spotted the walls. Soldiers patrolled in pairs, weapons at the ready. Daenerys joined Jon and a few trusted advisors in the Great Hall for a meager supper. Rations were dwindling. Though the immediate future overshadowed any concerns of hunger, they knew a prolonged siege could be disastrous. Daenerys forced herself to eat, though her stomach churned with tension. After supper, she dismissed herself, intending to retire, though in truth she only wanted solitude. She walked through the stone corridors, footsteps echoing. She wished she could walk outside without everyone's eyes upon her. The responsibilities of command weighed heavily. She used to have Missandei by her side. Missandei, whose quiet counsel and friendship had soothed her in ways no one else could. But Missandei was gone, lost to the cruelty of war. Her absence was a fresh wound. Daenerys clenched her fists, feeling sorrow stir into anger. How many people had she lost to the battle for the Iron Throne, and now to the battle for the living? She passed by a set of small windows overlooking the courtyard. In the darkness, she caught sight of her reflection in the glass, illuminated by torchlight. For a fleeting instant, she thought her eyes glowed blue. She jerked back, heart pounding, and when she looked again, it was only her usual violet gaze. She pressed a hand to her temple, breath trembling. She needed rest. Perhaps it was only her imagination running wild. Yet as she climbed the steps to her chamber, she sensed an icy presence trailing her. She heard a breath of wind that sounded like a voice calling her name. Daenerys, Daenerys. She stopped in the corridor, twisting around, but saw no one. A single torch flickered in a sconce, shadows dancing on the wall. With a deliberate exhalation, she marched forward, refusing to let the fear show. Once inside her room, she shut the door and latched it. The chamber was quiet, a single candle lighting the table. She shrugged off her cloak, draping it over a chair, and moved to the fireplace to stoke the embers. The warmth was meager, but she basked in it, as though trying to chase away the chill that clung to her. Gradually, her heartbeat slowed. Then she felt it, a subtle shift in the air, as if the temperature dropped by several degrees. She spun around, expecting to see a wight or some intruder, but the chamber was empty. Her breath misted, and she realized that the room had grown unnaturally cold. A shape flickered in the corner of her vision, a fleeting silhouette of the Night King's visage. She blinked, and it was gone. Yet the disorienting cold remained, pressing against her mind. "Leave me," she whispered aloud, though she could not say to whom. The chill did not abate. Instead, she felt a faint pressure on her thoughts, like icy tendrils searching for cracks in her psyche. Daenerys grit her teeth, summoning her defiance. She was no stranger to mental fortitude. She had resisted the manipulations of warlocks and tyrants. She had walked through flame unburnt. So she closed her eyes, pictured the fire that ran in her veins, and pushed back at the intrusion. For a moment, the cold receded, yet it did not vanish entirely. A sinister voice, no louder than a whisper of wind, spoke in the recesses of her mind. "You have lost so much, Daenerys Targaryen. You have burned cities. You have been betrayed. The world abandons you." The voice was eerily dispassionate, without inflection or anger. "Let the cold free you of your pain." She clenched her fists, nails biting into her palms. "No," she hissed through gritted teeth. She remembered the faces of those who had wronged her, but also those who had followed her, believed in her, loved her. She remembered the mercy she had shown and the mistakes she had made. These were her truths. Even her darkest moments were still hers alone, not for a monstrous being to twist. The voice persisted, slipping through her defenses with uncanny ease. "Your dragons will fall. Your armies will crumble. But with my power, you would be invincible. You would know no betrayal, no heartbreak, only unyielding strength." Daenerys felt her knees weaken as a wave of exhaustion crashed over her mind. She fought it, fighting the sense of drifting in an endless sea of frost. "I am Daenerys Stormborn," she managed, her breath ragged. "I will never bow to you." The cold constricted like a vice, and for an instant, she caught a fleeting image of her reflection in a mirror. Eyes burning with blue fire, not the vibrant hue of her Targaryen blood, but the eerie glow of the undead. She gasped and snapped her eyes open. She was on her knees before the fireplace, gripping the edge of the stone hearth as though it were the only thing anchoring her to reality. Slowly, the temperature lifted, and warmth crept back. The presence slithered away, leaving her heart pounding. She stayed like that for a long time, chest heaving, uncertain how much time had passed. Her limbs trembled with adrenaline. Finally, she mustered the strength to stand. She stared into the flickering embers, sweat beading on her forehead. The fleeting vision of her eyes glowing blue haunted her. She swallowed, forcing a steady breath. The Night King had indeed found a crack in her armor. Daenerys realized she needed to tell Jon, or at least Tyrion, but a fierce pride warred with her sense of duty. She did not want anyone to see her as vulnerable, especially now, when morale was precarious. Yet the risk was too great. She had to confide in someone. She made her decision. She pulled on her cloak again, ignoring the exhaustion in her bones, and left her chamber, the corridor silent at this late hour. She found Jon in the council room, as if he had known sleep would not come easily and had decided to lose himself in plans. He looked up sharply as she entered, a flicker of concern crossing his features. "Daenerys," he said quietly, "what is it?" He could read the disquiet in her eyes. She closed the door behind her, leaning on it for a moment. "He was here," she said, voice shaking slightly. "Not in the flesh, but in my mind. He tried to—" She faltered, collecting herself. "He tried to corrupt me. I felt it. This is more than a dream or a passing shadow, Jon. He is reaching into my very thoughts." Jon's face darkened. He crossed the room and took her hands in his, feeling the coolness of her skin. "Are you all right?" He searched her gaze as though looking for any trace of unnatural blue. She nodded quickly, though she still felt the remnants of that icy touch. "I fought him off, for now." Her throat tightened. "He wants me, and by extension, the dragons. If he corrupts me, he corrupts them, and we would lose everything." Jon's grip tightened gently, a wave of protectiveness washing over him. "We'll find a way to keep him out," he vowed. "We'll use the wards the magic Sam found, and if we need more, we'll search every corner of this world for knowledge to protect you." Daenerys allowed herself to lean on him momentarily, resting her forehead against his shoulder. The closeness calmed her frayed nerves, reminding her that she was not alone. "I don't know how strong he's become," she murmured, "but I fear that each time he tries, he'll push deeper. I felt so close to succumbing." Jon steadied her, the warmth of his body a stark contrast to the lingering chill in her soul. "You're the strongest person I know," he reassured her, brushing a strand of silver hair from her face. "You've withstood fire and betrayal. You will resist him, too." She exhaled shakily, wanting to believe it. "We must prepare. If we don't act, one night I might not be able to hold him off." Jon nodded, determination etched into his features. "We will act. At dawn, we'll speak with Bran again and Sam. We'll double the wards, find whatever protective spells exist, and we'll set a watch on you. If you slip away or act strangely, we'll know." Though the idea of being constantly watched was not comforting, Daenerys understood the necessity. If the Night King did manage to compromise her, it would be better if she was not alone, able to slip away unnoticed. She swallowed, forcing herself to remain composed. "All right," she said, stepping back slightly, though not letting go of Jon's hands just yet. He studied her face, his voice hushed. "We'll do everything we can," he whispered. Then he added, "I won't lose you." She gave a trembling smile, the ghost of her usual confidence. "Nor I you." It was a simple exchange, but it held a world of promise and fear. Daenerys felt the lingering cold in the corners of her mind, a cruel reminder that the Night King was always there, waiting for a moment's weakness. The next days were consumed by frantic effort. Under Sam and Bran's guidance, small carved runes of dragonglass lace stone were placed in strategic locations throughout Winterfell. The masons worked tirelessly, scoring symbols into the walls at each entrance, each vulnerable point. Daenerys found the unrelenting focus at least offered some distraction, though occasionally she felt that chill brush her consciousness. Each time, she steeled herself and forced it away, clinging to the warmth of her identity, her memories of friends and lost loved ones, everything that made her human. Jon stayed close, though he had his own responsibilities, overseeing the troops, coordinating with the Northern Lords, ensuring that the supply lines still functioned. Grey Worm and the Unsullied quietly added another ring of security around Daenerys, though they tried to be discreet, for fear that openly guarding their queen so carefully might sow panic among the rank and file. Tyrion remained at Daenerys' side whenever he could, offering counsel and reminding her to rest, to eat, to keep her strength up. Late on the third night after the initial attack on her mind, Daenerys felt an urgent pull, a summons from the courtyard. She had been drifting into a shallow sleep, but Drogon's restless roar jolted her awake. She threw on her cloak and hurried out, meeting Jon in the corridor. Together, they rushed down the stairs to see what had roused the dragon. Soldiers scrambled in confusion, torches raised high. Drogon bellowed, eyes wild, as though he sensed something monstrous. Rhaegal was also on edge, stomping in circles, wings fluttering anxiously. Daenerys approached Drogon, arms outstretched to show she was no threat. A wave of intense cold struck her mind, and she reeled, staggering backward. It was more forceful than before. She felt her vision blur, and when she blinked, she saw the courtyard flicker between reality and a twisted version blanketed in eternal night, filled with silent whites. Then a swirl of snow swallowed that vision, and she was back in the courtyard, gasping for breath as Jon steadied her. The other watchers saw none of this, only Daenerys stumble and clutch at her head. Tyrion and Grey Worm rushed to her side. She tried to speak, but could only manage a ragged whisper. "He's here, in my mind." Jon held her shoulders, searching her eyes. The wards carved into the walls glimmered faintly, as though a subtle magic was active. Yet the Night King's power had grown. With a surge of willpower, Daenerys regained enough clarity to push back at the force invading her mind. She felt the presence recoil slightly, as though repelled by the wards, but not fully banished. Sweat beaded on her brow in the icy air. Tyrion looked around, half expecting whites to start pouring over the walls. But there was no physical assault. This attack was aimed at Daenerys alone. The soldiers stood on high alert, scanning the darkness beyond the torch's reach, but no movement came from the night. This was a psychological siege, slow and insidious. Daenerys wavered, and Jon caught her in his arms. She panted, trying to clear her head. The advantage the Night King held was horrifying. He could strike at her in the safety of her fortress, behind wards, and each time he withdrew, it felt like he took a piece of her warmth with him. She fought off the dread, clinging to her identity as Daenerys Targaryen. Summoning her resolve, she looked up at her followers. Her voice trembled, but she forced strength into it. "He wants me to ride north. He is calling me, taunting me." She almost staggered again, but Jon's firm grip kept her upright. The notion filled her with a dire certainty. The Night King sought to separate her from her allies, lure her into his domain. Perhaps he believed that his advantage in cold magic would be overwhelming. Jon's face twisted in concern. "Then we cannot let you go anywhere near him." He glared at the night sky, as though he might see the Night King hovering on the horizon. Daenerys took a shaky breath, pulling away from Jon enough to stand on her own. "But perhaps that is exactly what we must do," she said, her voice low. "We cannot wait for him to whittle away at me like this. If we continue to sit here, eventually he will find a moment to breach my mind fully. We need to confront him and finish this." Tyrion stepped forward, eyes wide. "Your Grace, with all due respect, that sounds like exactly the trap he wants you to step into." Daenerys nodded, acknowledging the risk. "Yes, it is a trap, but we cannot ignore the truth. The longer we wait, the weaker I become. Already I feel exhausted in ways I've never felt before. He's wearing me down. So let us turn the trap on its head. If we prepare carefully, if we choose the time and place, we might stand a chance." She ran a trembling hand over Drogon's scales. The dragon was still agitated, rumbling his distress. "We can't simply be reactive anymore." Jon looked torn, glancing at Tyrion, who wore a pinched expression. Grey Worm's jaw tensed, and the soldiers all around them remained silent, waiting for their queen's decree. No one here had any illusions about what it would mean to ride against the Night King, especially in the harsh lands to the north. "We speak with Bran," Daenerys decided firmly. "He may see something in his visions that can help us. Then we gather a small, swift force. The dragons, the best of our warriors. We move north and lure the Night King into the open. If it works, we destroy him. If it fails..." She did not finish the sentence, but all knew what that meant. Tyrion swallowed, searching for a less perilous option but finding none. Daenerys was right. If the Night King continued to attack her mind, eventually she might succumb. And if the living lost Daenerys Targaryen, if she returned, her dragons would follow. The war would be lost. A desperate plan, he murmured. But perhaps the only one we have left. Jon squeezed Daenerys' shoulder, looking into her eyes. We do this together, he said. I won't let you face him alone. She nodded, mustering the fire that still burned within her. We end this nightmare, she said resolutely. Although she felt the cold infiltration lingering at the edges of her consciousness, she would not let it define her. She was still the mother of dragons, and if a final confrontation was what fate demanded, then she would face it head-on. The wind whipped around them, scattering snow, as though the night itself echoed with the clash of powerful magic. Fire and ice locked in an ancient struggle. Daenerys clenched her fists and stared at the dark horizon. There, in the emptiness, she imagined the Night King, waiting with silent malevolence. She vowed to bring him the storm he had never known. The dawn that followed was a day of planning and swift action. Daenerys summoned the key figures to map out the details of their bold gambit. Bran, in a distant, serene voice, recounted the lay of the land north of the Wall. What remained of the shattered barrier was still passable at certain points. The undead might be scattered across that frozen waste, with the Night King likely near the center of his power. They decided on Ghost Hill, a high vantage point several days north of the remnants of the Wall, as their staging ground. From there, the dragons could cover more ground, and if the Night King showed himself, they had open sky to maneuver. The old arguments resurfaced. Fear that they were riding into a trap, that the full might of the dead would be waiting. Yet the alternative was slowly being crushed by the Night King's subtle assaults. Daenerys, ever resolute, declared that she would lead the expedition with Jon by her side. Grey Worm would accompany them with a contingent of Unsullied, as well as a few volunteers from the northern houses who were skilled fighters and who understood the treacherous terrain. The rest would remain at Winterfell to hold the fortress against any surprise attack. Tyrion argued to accompany them as well, but Daenerys insisted he remain behind to govern in her absence and to coordinate a fallback if something went wrong. Emotions ran high. Gendry volunteered to join, forging new dragonglass-tipped spears. Arya Stark, newly returned from a scouting mission, insisted on coming, her eyes cold with determination. Even Sansa, unflinching in her duty to the north, argued she should not be left behind. But the plan demanded swiftness and stealth, so they agreed that only those with the necessary skills would venture north. Sansa would stay to rule in Winterfell's name, a position she did not relish but accepted out of responsibility. Within 2 days, the expedition was prepared. The wards around Daenerys had been strengthened as much as possible. Bran attempted to peer into the future, but the glimpses were murky. He saw only swirling snow and the faint shape of a dragon spiraling downward in the blizzard. Whether it was a vision of tragedy or triumph, he could not discern. Nonetheless, the decision was made. They rode out at dawn, the dragons overhead, the ground force below, heading for the passage through the ruined wall. The cold was unrelenting, and soon the land transformed into a white wilderness. Daenerys felt the Night King's presence grow stronger as they ventured further north. It was as though each league brought her closer to the center of a deadly vortex. Yet the wards etched into her armor, the dragonglass amulet that Sam had crafted, and the unwavering presence of her allies helped stave off the worst of the mental attacks. Jon rode beside her, face set in a grim expression. He understood these lands better than most, having journeyed beyond the wall more than once. But never had it been so devoid of life. It was as if the entire region lay under a spell of deathly quiet. The wind howled across the snowdrifts, occasionally revealing the scattered remains of villages or outposts, each one empty and lifeless. Their procession continued for days, camping in fortified positions at night. Daenerys insisted on taking watch despite Jon's protests. She wanted to show that she was not afraid, that she was still the queen who led by example. Yet she dared not sleep deeply, for fear the Night King would slip into her mind when her defenses were down. One evening, As they camped near a cluster of frozen trees, Daenerys felt the faint pull again. She excused herself from the campfire, walking alone into the swirling snow. Rhaegal, perched nearby, rumbled uneasily. She heard footsteps behind her and turned to see Arya approach, silent as a wraith. The young Stark woman regarded her coolly. "Are you all right?" Arya asked, though her voice was laced with more curiosity than warmth. Daenerys looked out at the white expanse, hugging her cloak around her. "He's near," she whispered, ignoring the question. "I can feel him." Arya followed her gaze, though she saw only snow. "Jon told me about his attempts on your mind." Her expression did not betray fear or pity, only a factual acceptance. "He's chosen the wrong person to try to control." A ghost of a smile touched Daenerys's lips. "I wish I shared your certainty. I can fight him, but I feel the cost each time. It's like a piece of me goes cold, and I have to relight the fire inside." Arya studied her a moment longer. "What did you learn when you were forced to survive the Dothraki Sea? Or in Meereen when you faced rebellion after rebellion? You found your strength in unlikely places. You'll find it again here." Then she turned and left, as quietly as she had arrived, leaving Daenerys to her solitude. The next morning, they finally reached Ghost Hill, a bleak, rocky rise overlooking an expanse of ice. Once, it might have been a vantage point used by the Night's Watch, but now it stood abandoned, battered by the elements. The group set about establishing a defensive perimeter. The Unsullied formed tight formations, Grey Worm orchestrating every detail with drilled precision. Arya and a handful of skilled rangers took position in the scattered rocks, scanning the horizon with bows at the ready. Meanwhile, Daenerys and Jon prepared the dragons, checking their saddles and ensuring they remained calm. The plan was both simple and wildly dangerous. Daenerys and Jon would circle the region on dragonback, hoping to draw out the Night King. If he appeared, they would engage him with dragonfire. The ground forces would remain hidden, ready to strike should the Night King bring Whites or White Walkers in support. The terrain gave a slight advantage, with large crags and rocky outcroppings that could serve as choke points. Daenerys stood before Drogon, resting a hand on his black scales. She felt his heat, more comforting than any hearth. "Whatever happens," she whispered to her dragon, "I am with you, my child." Drogon let out a low rumble of acknowledgement, as though he understood her words. Jon approached from behind, placing a hand on her shoulder. She turned to him, their eyes meeting in silent communication. "Are you ready?" he asked quietly. She nodded. "Ready as I'll ever be." She glanced at the horizon. The sky was overcast, a steel gray, and a cold wind battered them. One way or another, this ends. They mounted their dragons, and with powerful beats of leathery wings, the creatures took flight. Below them, the assembled soldiers braced themselves, gripping spears tipped with dragonglass. Grey Worm stood stoically, unwavering. Arya's gaze flickered from the sky to the surrounding tundra, her hand resting on the hilt of a Valyrian steel dagger. The flight took them far over the desolate waste. From this high vantage, Daenerys searched for any sign of movement. At first, there was nothing but endless ice. Then, a faint shift at the edge of her vision, something dark against the white. Daenerys guided Drogon lower, Jon following on Rhaegal. As they descended, she felt the chill in her mind intensify. Her breath caught in her throat. The corruption was near. Then she saw him, a lone figure, mounted on the undead Viserion, rising from behind a low ice ridge. The Night King, his pale skin blended with the snow, his tattered robes flapping in the wind, and his eyes glowed with that unearthly blue. Viserion's once beautiful cream and gold scales were now marred with cracks of icy blue, a maw that exhaled cold mist instead of fire. The presence in Daenerys's mind flared, bombarding her with an overwhelming cold. She gasped, nearly losing her grip on Drogon's reins. Drogon roared, sensing his rider's distress. With gritted teeth, Daenerys pushed back, summoning the heat of her own spirit. Drogon responded, unleashing a torrent of flame into the sky, a challenge to the abomination that had once been his brother. Below, Jon guided Rhaegal into an intercept course. He and Daenerys had practiced this maneuver, hoping to catch the Night King between two streams of dragonfire. But the Night King urged Viserion higher with an eerie calm. A blast of icy breath erupted from Viserion's jaws, meeting Drogon's fire in midair. The clash of frost and flame created a violent explosion of steam and mist, obscuring the battlefield for a moment. Daenerys squinted through the swirling fog, straining to keep track of the Night King. Suddenly, she felt the corruption spike in her mind, as though an icy hand clutched her soul. She screamed, the sound lost in the roar of wind and dragons. For an instant, her vision blurred, the world fading to a cold emptiness. She fought desperately, clinging to her identity, her reason for fighting. In that haze, a voice, distant yet distinct, whispered, "Submit. Join me. End your suffering." Daenerys nearly faltered, but at the final moment, she felt the bond with Drogon surging through her. She remembered the day of his birth from the eggs, the first time she had called him "my son," the love she felt for her dragon, for her people, for this world she had sworn to protect, galvanized her. She wrenched herself free of the icy grip. Drogon sensed her will, and with a spine-rattling roar, he dove through the steam, jaws parted. Daenerys aimed him at the Night King. She glimpsed Viserion's undead eyes narrowing as the abomination twisted away, but Drogon's jaws clamped down on Viserion's flank. A sickening crunch reverberated through Daenerys' saddle as undead scales cracked. Viserion shrieked in rage and pain, lashing out with claws that scored Drogon's neck, black scales splintering. The two dragons tumbled in the air, locked in savage combat. Jon swooped in on Rhaegal, adding another jet of flame. The Night King raised his spear of ice, and for a terrifying moment, Daenerys thought he might hurl it at Rhaegal, repeating the fate of Viserion. But instead, he clung to Viserion's back, icy magic radiating outward to repel the scorching heat. Below, the ground force advanced, seeing the aerial melee. The whites that had been hidden now emerged in droves, clawing from beneath the snowdrifts, a cunning ambush. Yet Grey Worm and the Unsullied held formation, driving their spears into the undead ranks. Arrows from Arya and the Rangers struck down the first wave of White Walkers that emerged from behind the icy ridge. In the sky, Daenerys and Drogon continued to grapple with Viserion. She saw blood, real and undead, spattering the air in crimson and blue-black droplets. The Night King stared at her with an expression of cold malevolence, raising a hand. A wave of that familiar mental attack slammed into her. Daenerys felt her mind reel. She struggled, but this time she sensed him pushing deeper, finding her fears, her grief, her anger. She felt her sense of self begin to crack like thinning ice. She thought of Missandei, whose last words were of loyalty. She thought of Ser Jorah dying in her arms, of the countless freed slaves in Essos calling her Mysa. She thought of Jon, who had pledged himself to her against all odds, and the nights they spent clinging to hope. She remembered standing in the flames as her dragons hatched, the pure heat of life and rebirth. That flame was her truth. "No," she whispered, though the single word turned into a fierce roar in her mind. With every scrap of resolve, she shoved back, letting the memory of fire burn away the infection of ice. The Night King recoiled, blinking in apparent surprise. That momentary lapse was enough. Drogon twisted, pulling free of Viserion's grip. Jon and Rhaegal took advantage, diving in with a coordinated blast of dragonfire. At such close range, the Night King could not fully shield himself. The flame bathed Viserion's body, licking across the Night King's form. The undead dragon howled, battered by the conflagration. Daenerys urged Drogon to unleash his own fire, merging with Rhaegal's to create a superheated torrent that seared across Viserion's wings. A keening wail echoed across the ice, and Viserion plummeted, his wings shredded, trailing black smoke. The Night King clung to the undead dragon's back, refusing to be dislodged. They slammed into the frozen expanse below with a thunderous impact, sending shards of ice flying. Daenerys spurred Drogon downward, determined to finish it. She saw the whites massing around the crash site, forming a protective horde. Grey Worm and the Unsullied pushed forward, forging a path through the undead. Jon circled overhead on Regal, scanning for an opening. Daenerys and Drogon landed heavily, unleashing gouts of flame at the whites. The heat was intense, melting snow and cracking ice. Soldiers charged in, dragonglass blades slicing through skeletal limbs. The White Walkers among them, tall and gaunt, hissed with rage, but were cut down by a coordinated effort. Daenerys leapt from Drogon's saddle, heart pounding, ignoring Jon's shout to stay aloft. She advanced on the fallen dragon, forging her way through the chaos. Each step was an act of will. The Night King's presence scraped at her psyche, but she had the advantage now. She was on the offensive. Viserion thrashed, half immobilized by mortal wounds, though still undead, his eyes blazing blue. Daenerys locked eyes with the monstrous creature that had once been her beloved child. A flash of sorrow tore at her heart. She remembered Viserion's gentleness, how he had nuzzled her hand when he was small. Then she saw the Night King dismount, his expression calm, brandishing the ice spear. He stepped toward her, whites parting in his wake. Daenerys raised her hand, a swirl of anger and heartbreak coalescing in her chest. She shouted at Drogon, and the dragon roared, sending a rush of flame across the Night King's path. But the ancient enemy lifted his hand, summoning an icy shield. The fire broke around him, some of it curling into steam, some penetrating to sear his flesh. He strode through it, small pieces of charred armor falling away. His face showed no pain, only ruthless intent. Daenerys felt her resolve waver under that ghastly gaze, but she hardened herself. She was so close. If she could destroy him here, the entire army of the dead would fall. The Night King raised the ice spear, poised to hurl it at her. She knew that if it struck, she would be lost. Summoning her last reserves of courage, Daenerys lunged aside, the spear whistling past her. It impacted a boulder, shattering it into 1,000 shards of ice and rock. From her peripheral vision, Daenerys saw Jon charging on foot, having leapt from Regal's back. His Valyrian steel sword gleamed in the cold light. He crashed into the Night King with all his might, forcing the tall figure back. The Night King parried with an ice-forged blade, the impact sending frost crystals swirling. Jon pressed the attack, slashing furiously. Yet the Night King was formidable, moving with unnatural speed and precision. Daenerys seized her chance. She picked up a dragonglass-dipped spear from a fallen Unsullied. Clutching it tightly, she rushed forward. The Night King shoved Jon aside, whirling to face her. A slash of his ice sword caught her across the arm, a searing cold that cut deeper than steel. She bit back a scream, refusing to yield. With her good arm, she drove the dragonglass spear toward his chest. The Night King twisted, the spear grazing his side. Dark, frosty ichor dripped from the wound, sizzling on the ice. He caught her wrist in an iron grip, and Daenerys felt the unstoppable cold flooding into her veins. Her mind reeled, the corruption overwhelming her. Visions exploded behind her eyes. Herself, standing at the head of an undead dragon army, her hair white with frost, eyes glowing blue, raining devastation on the living. For a heartbeat, she saw that future. It called to her with a dreadful simplicity. No more pain, no more heartbreak, just the silent dominion of ice. Her grip on the spear slackened. Then she heard Jon's voice, screaming her name, and felt the faint flicker of her own fire deep within. She summoned that spark, the core of her being that refused subjugation. She was Daenerys Stormborn of the House Targaryen, the first of her name, breaker of chains, mother of dragons. She would not be enslaved, not by mortal men, not by warlocks, and certainly not by the Night King. With a final surge of will, she channeled all the fury and love inside her. She drove the dragonglass spear deeper into his torso. The Night King's eyes widened in shock, his cold grip faltering. His power lashed out in a final attempt to take her mind, but Daenerys held firm. With a shudder, the ancient creature staggered. Jon, recovering from being knocked aside, lunged back into the fray. Longclaw, gleaming with Valyrian steel, swung in a deadly arc, striking the Night King's exposed back. The blade bit deep, releasing a burst of frost-laden air. A soundless cry twisted the Night King's features as cracks of ice spread across his body. With a final, thunderous release of power, he shattered, exploding into a flurry of snow and shards. The whites around them froze mid-attack, then collapsed into lifeless heaps. Viserion undead form stilled, the blue fire fading from his eyes. Finally, the monstrous creature disintegrated into dust and bone, leaving only the memory of who he once was. An eerie silence draped the battlefield. Daenerys, crumpling to her knees, felt the last vestiges of the Night King's presence vanish from her mind. She was free. Jon rushed to her side, pulling her into his arms. She trembled, cold from the wounds and from the aftermath of the struggle. Blood trickled from her arm, the cut inflicted by the Night King's blade. Yet she was alive, mind and soul intact. She gazed up at Jon, relief mingled with sorrow for what it had cost. Around them, the soldiers raised a ragged cheer, though many had fallen. Grey Worm emerged from the fray, battered but alive, leading the remaining unsullied. Arya knelt by a fallen ranger, sadness in her eyes. The field was littered with the corpses of whites and the living alike, a reminder that victory always comes with a price. Drogon lowered his head, letting out a low, keening moan of triumph and mourning. Rhaegal landed with a labored flap, his flank wounded, though he remained proud and defiant. Daenerys reached for Drogon's massive jaw, pressing her forehead against his scales. She whispered thanks to him for his unflinching loyalty. At last, Daenerys rose, leaning on Jon for support. A hush settled over the survivors as they gazed upon her. The gloom overhead seemed to lighten, as though the very skies recognized that the ancient threat had passed. Daenerys looked around at her allies, her family in all but blood, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, she did not sense the Night King's cold eyes upon her. The darkness was lifted, and in its place was a dawn of possibility. Jon gently squeezed her hand. Their gazes locked, and in that moment, neither needed words. They had faced the worst horror imaginable and emerged victorious, together. Daenerys inhaled the biting northern air, wincing at the sting in her injured arm, but savoring the taste of freedom from the creeping corruption that had haunted her. She was still the breaker of chains, and now she had broken the chain of ice that had threatened her soul. Thus ended the Night King's final bid for dominance, and with it, the ancient war between fire and ice. Winter was not yet over. Snow still blanketed the land, and bitter winds would blow for some time. Yet, with the Night King destroyed, the living had reclaimed a spark of hope. Daenerys stood at the center of that new dawn, bloodied, exhausted, but unbowed. She looked to the future with cautious optimism, knowing that though she had triumphed over darkness, many challenges lay ahead. But for now, at least, the world was safe from the cold hand of the dead, and Daenerys Targaryen's spirit burned bright once more. Daenerys Targaryen stood in the snowy expanse, her breath still ragged, her arm burning from the Night King's blade. The wind whipped her silver hair across her face, drawing strands into her mouth and eyes, though she barely felt it through the lingering rush of pain and adrenaline. All around her, the corpses of whites lay inert, drained now of the unholy animation that had once propelled them. The air hummed with the aftermath of terrible sorcery. Jon Snow's strong arms supported her, and she gripped his leathers in return, leaning heavily against him until she regained her balance. In those moments, the hush was so total it felt as if the entire world were holding its breath. Grey Worm approached, spear in hand, battered breastplate spattered with blackened ichor. He bowed his head briefly. "Your Grace," he said, voice tight with both relief and the stern discipline of a commander. Behind him, the remaining unsullied stood in formation. Their faces, though schooled into stoic masks, betrayed a measure of weary gratitude that the living had prevailed. The swirling snow seemed to hush the moans of the wounded, as though even the elements knew some solemn peace had been achieved. Near a tumble of jagged ice and rock, Arya Stark knelt beside a fallen ranger. She gripped the ranger's hand as he took his last few breaths, giving him what little comfort she could. After a quiet moment, she closed his eyes, rose smoothly, and walked toward Daenerys and Jon. Her hair whipped in the wind, her expression unreadable, but there was a flicker of relief when she saw Daenerys upright and conscious. Arya surveyed the battlefield. It was a place of both devastation and unexpected triumph. Bodies of the living and the dead frozen in their final moments, shattered whites scattered like broken dolls. But the oppressive aura, that sense of impending doom, had lifted. Jon kept one arm firmly around Daenerys. She felt his concern not just as a warrior, but as someone who had nearly lost a person he cared deeply about. Daenerys, still dizzy, leaned into him. "He's gone," she said quietly, her voice hoarse. Even speaking those words felt surreal after all the nightmares, the battles, the close brushes with despair. "The Night King is truly gone." Jon nodded, looking off into the distance where the Night King had shattered into snow and shards of ice. He managed, voice subdued. "It's over." Yet even as those words left his lips, neither of them missed the sight of the bodies around them. Scores of loyal soldiers, rangers, and friends who would never stand again. Daenerys felt a pang of sorrow, a twist of guilt that they had been forced into this final confrontation. Had it truly been the only way? She had believed so, especially with the Night King pressing relentlessly into her mind. The alternative might have been her corruption, and the prospect of unleashing a horror worse than any the living had ever known. Yet the price was unmistakably high. Drogon rumbled, stamping the snow with his massive claws as he limped closer. Smoke curled from the edges of his jaws, and dark blood oozed from a jagged wound near his shoulder where Viserion's talons had raked him. The sight of her mighty dragon in pain hardened Daenerys' resolve. She reached out to touch Drogon's quivering flank, feeling the heat beneath his scorched scales. He lowered his head, pressing his snout close to her, letting out a chuffing breath that blew warmth across her hair. Even in agony, he sought to comfort her. Nearby, regal, battered but alive, perched on a rocky shelf. The green dragon's sides heaved as he struggled for breath, his wings torn in places from the aerial battle. Jon turned his gaze to him, relief flooding his features. They had lost so much, Viserion first, then countless allies, but at least 2 dragons remained, albeit injured. Daenerys allowed herself a faint hope that they could heal in time. A stir went through the gathered soldiers as Grey Worm helped direct the retrieval of the wounded. Arya, scanning the horizon, seemed to sense no further threat. The great silence of the north stretched on. The swirling snow obscured the distance, but no new horrors emerged. The unnatural cold that had plagued Daenerys for weeks no longer pressed at her mind. A meager glow of sunlight, pale and watery, slipped through a rent in the clouds, painting the white landscape with an otherworldly light. It felt like a benediction, or perhaps a sign that the gods, old or new, acknowledged their victory. Jon gently guided Daenerys to where a few of the unsullied medics and maesters traveling with them had set up a makeshift aid station. She tried to brush off his concern, but the pain in her arm proved too sharp to ignore. The slash from the Night King's sword continued to ache with a frigid throb, as though some remnant of his unnatural cold lingered in the wound. She clenched her teeth as the medics carefully cut away the torn leather near her shoulder. She saw the gash, skin already darkened around the edges, though not black like a white's infection. Still, there was an unsettling pallor, as though the blade had burned with ice. The maester pressed a steaming poultice against the injury, and Daenerys hissed, arching her back. Jon hovered behind her, his hand on her good shoulder. She took comfort in his presence, recalling how closely they had fought side by side, despite everything that had happened in their journey. Her initial mistrust, the tensions between Targaryen and Stark, the revelation of Jon's lineage, they had come to stand as one in this final confrontation. While the medics tended to her wound, Daenerys stared over at the pile of lifeless whites. They looked strangely small and pitiful now without the Night King's will animating them. Mere broken bones and scraps of flesh. She wondered at the twisted magic that had given them such monstrous purpose. Now it was over, but the memory of that living darkness would never fully leave her. She remembered the creeping presence in her mind, the seductive pull of an icy oblivion. Only her love, of her people, her dragons, the man beside her, had kept her from that fate. In a lull, Grey Worm approached, confirming in a subdued voice that all the whites had collapsed. The rest of the White Walkers had likewise disintegrated into brittle shards of ice and bone. The entire undead host was destroyed. Their victory was total, yet so was the cost. More than half the force they had brought with them lay dead or gravely wounded. Some of the northern volunteers who had insisted on joining this mission now lay cold and silent on the ground, leaving behind families at Winterfell who would never see them return. The thought weighed on Daenerys' heart, but she steeled herself and nodded at Grey Worm, acknowledging his report. A soft, somber call drew Daenerys' attention. Ser Davos Seaworth emerged from the swirling snow, his expression a mix of grim exhaustion and relief. "It's done," he said simply, glancing at the battered armies. "We need to gather the survivors and see them back to Winterfell. This is no land to linger in." Daenerys inclined her head. "We'll rest here for the night, then begin the journey back at first light," she said. "The dragons need to mend, and the men need what little shelter and warmth we can find before marching." Her voice was weak but resolute. She glanced up at the bleak sky. Dawn was still a few hours away, but the night's darkness no longer held the same terror. No one truly wanted to remain in this wasteland, but fatigue weighed on them. The prospect of trudging back through the endless snow immediately, with wounded dragons and soldiers, was too daunting. They erected what tents and windbreaks they could. Fires were lit, though fuel was scarce. The soldiers broke into shifts for rest and watch, even though no one expected a surprise attack now that the Night King had been defeated. Old habits of war die hard. Daenerys remained near one of the fires, her cloak drawn tight, eyes half-lidded. The wound on her arm throbbed less, thanks to the maester's poultice, but she sensed a deep ache in her bones. Jon sat beside her, silent, gazing into the flickering flames. Neither needed words. The exhaustion in their bodies was mirrored in their souls. Yet the relief was real. Even as they endured the memory of chaos, a new dawn of possibility lay ahead. Slowly, others gathered. Arya stood by the fire with them, arms crossed. Davos paced around the perimeter, quietly supervising the watchmen. Grey Worm took a seat across from Daenerys, and for a moment, the two locked eyes. She saw in him the same unspoken question she saw in many. What comes next? They had fought for this moment, for life to triumph over the icy darkness. Now that it was done, they had to shape a new future. Tyrion was not present. He had remained in Winterfell to govern in her absence, per her orders. Sansa had helped him, no doubt, rallying the North to keep its defenses strong in case the Night King had sent a diversion. Those in the company here had only a fraction of the normal chain of command. Daenerys saw men wearing the sigils of various houses, Mormont, Glover, and even some Targaryen banners from her original forces. Their banners now drooped in the wind, ice-crusted and torn, a battered band of survivors. Eventually, Daenerys drifted into a fitful sleep, huddled in her cloak by the fire. She dreamt of a swirling whiteness, of blue eyes staring through the cold, and then of Drogon's roar blasting the darkness away. When she awoke, she found the horizon touched by the barest hint of pale light. Ghostly shapes of men and tents took form under the new dawn. The ache in her arm persisted, but the throbbing had receded to something tolerable. She stood, ignoring how stiff her muscles felt, and surveyed the camp. Soldiers quietly packed bedrolls, rechecked weapons, and prepared to depart. She found Jon with Rhaegal, tending to the dragon's torn wing. Two Unsullied were helping wrap a long linen bandage around the damaged membrane. Rhaegal hissed in protest, but accepted their help. Daenerys approached, murmuring soothing words in High Valyrian. She ran her fingers along the dragon's scales, which were caked with frozen blood. Regal's golden eyes flicked to hers. She felt a pang of sympathy for him. He was the second-born of her children, now shouldering the loss of his brother Viserion, and nearly destroyed again in this final battle. Jon gave her a small nod, acknowledging her presence. "He'll fly again," he said, voice low, "but it may take time." Daenerys placed a hand on Regal's flank. "We'll give him all the time he needs," she said softly. "What of Drogon?" Grey Worm said he's faring slightly better. The laceration on his shoulder is deep, but it shouldn't threaten his ability to fly in the long term. Jon paused, glancing at the rest of the camp. "We'll move slowly, keep the dragons mostly on the ground for the first leg of the journey, see how they fare." Daenerys agreed. Her heart clenched at the thought of forcing Drogon or Regal into the sky before they were ready. The flight north had been harrowing enough. The idea of losing another dragon in transit was unthinkable. The group, battered and burdened with wounded, could afford to move with caution. When the column finally set forth, it was a grim procession across the frozen wasteland. Daenerys rode a sturdy horse provided by one of the Northerners, though the creature shied whenever Drogon rumbled. The dragons trudged alongside the main party, their massive forms shadowing the soldiers, sending up occasional huffs of steam from their nostrils. Several times a day, the company paused to rest, to tend to the wounded, to ensure no one fell behind in the snow. They left behind shallow graves for those who perished from their wounds on the march, marking each mound with a simple stake. Daenerys's heart grew heavier with each new loss. At one point, the column skirted the edge of a ragged ice canyon. The ground beneath them cracked ominously, forcing them to spread out and pick safer paths. A dozen men, the strongest of the Unsullied, used ropes to help guide the dragons across narrower passes. Daenerys walked through the swirling flurries, wrapped in fur and cloak, her boots crunching on newly formed crusts of ice. Each breath stung, but she was glad for the pain. It reminded her she was alive, that the Night King no longer reached into her mind. Jon walked beside her, each occasionally glancing at the other without speaking. Words had become almost superfluous in their bond. But Daenerys sensed something stirring in him, a weight he carried beyond the exhaustion of battle. She wondered if it was the unspoken conflict about his lineage, about how the Northern Lords might react now that the threat was gone. Did they still see her as an outsider, or had they witnessed enough to accept her? She decided to let the matter rest until they reached Winterfell. For now, survival and healing took priority. After nearly a week of difficult travel, the ragged column finally drew near the remnants of the wall. The massive breach created by the undead Viserion still gaped in the ice. A hush fell as they passed the crumbled ramparts, each soldier recalling the dread that had once poured through this gap. An entire undead army advancing into the living world. Now only silence remained, broken by the crunch of snow underfoot. Daenerys felt a strange swirl of emotions. Relief that they had slain the threat responsible for this ruin, sorrow at the memory of Viserion's fall, and a weary determination to see it all put behind them. Not long after, they came upon a hastily built outpost where some of the Night's Watch survivors and wildlings had been stationed. Tormund Giantsbane emerged from a log shelter, rubbing his thick beard. He hailed them with booming relief, though his cheer dimmed as he noticed how few had returned. Daenerys dismounted, wincing at the jolt to her arm, while Jon greeted Tormund with a weary clasp of forearms. Tormund's pale eyes flicked from Jon to Daenerys. "So you did it," he said, voice subdued for once. "The dead are gone." Jon nodded. "They are." Tormund let out a gusty sigh and shook his head. "I'll be damned." Then he waved a hand toward the outpost's rough palisade. "We can share our fires. Not much of a feast, but we have stew and drink to spare." Thus the company took a night to rest among the wildlings and Night's Watch men. It was far from comfortable. Wooden bunks, drafty huts, and a pervasive reek of old hides and sweat, but it felt like paradise compared to the exposure of the frozen wilderness. Daenerys allowed the maester to reapply salves to her wound, which now showed signs of normal healing. Despite the icy slash that had first left the skin pale and lifeless, the flesh had begun to knit in a more natural color. She exhaled in relief each time they checked for any lingering trace of blackening or necrosis. The corruption was truly gone. Drogon and Regal were given space in a partially collapsed stable and a makeshift corral. They lay on straw piles, dozing fitfully. Daenerys visited them, feeding each small lumps of salted meat from the outpost stores, an offering that did not fully sate such enormous beasts but helped keep their strength up. The dragons ate gingerly, as if they understood the need to ration. Their wounds, too, seemed to be healing, albeit slowly. Around the fires that night, the outpost echoed with subdued conversation. Tormund shared some crude jokes, trying to lighten the mood, but found few takers. Arya listened to him with a faintly bemused expression. Grey Worm said little. Jon quietly explained to Tormund how the final battle had gone, including the cunning ambush by the Night King. Daenerys sat close to the fire, letting the warmth seep into her bones. She felt the weight of many eyes upon her. Some were curious, others respectful. A few might have been wary, but after seeing or hearing how she and her dragons had confronted the undead threat, suspicion had softened. Eventually, Daenerys excused herself and slipped outside. The night air was crisp, but not as brutally cold as it had been farther north. She walked a short distance from the huts, needing space to breathe. She gazed up at the sky, noticing that the clouds had parted somewhat, revealing a scatter of stars. A voice at her shoulder caused her to turn. Jon stood there, expression concerned. "You shouldn't be out here alone," he said, though there was little censure in his tone. "Not after what you've been through." She gave him a faint smile. "I don't hear the wind calling my name anymore," she said softly. "He's gone. I can feel it, but I needed some air to think." Jon stepped closer, close enough for her to feel the slight brush of his cloak. "What do you feel now?" he asked, almost a whisper. Daenerys closed her eyes. She could still sense the magnitude of the loss, the men and women who would never see the sky again. She felt relief, guilt, gratitude. Her gaze returned to the stars. "Peace," she replied, though she wasn't entirely certain it was complete. There was so much to do. Even with the Night King vanquished, the realm was in tatters. She and Jon would have to decide how to move forward, how to govern, how to unite the land. Jon seemed to read her thoughts. He hesitated, then reached for her hand. "Winterfell awaits us," he said. "And beyond that, the rest of the 7 kingdoms. You came here to protect them from the dead, but you also came to claim the throne that was your birthright." She turned her head toward him, her hair catching the faint starlight. "Yes," she said quietly, "but so much has changed since then. I once believed the Iron Throne was my destiny. It still may be. Yet after this," she trailed off, swallowing a knot of uncertainty, "I will not pretend that old ambitions can simply vanish. I know I must rule if the realm is to be stable, to break the cycle of tyranny and cruelty. But I also know that trust, especially here in the north, is not given lightly." Jon nodded. A flicker of conflict crossed his face, as though he, too, struggled with the knowledge of his Targaryen heritage, of the fact that he could be seen as a rival claim to Daenerys. "The North saw what you did," he said finally. "How you fought for them, how you risked everything. That matters. Sansa, she has reservations, but even she will see the truth of your dedication. You saved our home more than once." Daenerys squeezed his hand. "Let's return to Winterfell," she said. "We'll rebuild, and we'll see what future we can forge together." Jon inclined his head in agreement, and for a moment, the unspoken weight between them felt lighter. They stood there under the stars, hearing only the distant rustle of the outpost. Daenerys found solace in the closeness, in the knowledge that, despite all the tragedies, they had each other to lean upon. She thought of the prophecy that once haunted her about the prince that was promised, about all the cryptic signs from the House of the Undying in Karth. Perhaps everything had led to this unity, the alliance of fire and ice, destroying the Night King forever. If so, the realm would still need guidance. someone to hold it together as the scars of war slowly healed. They continued their southward journey the following morning. The path through the gift was easier, with scattered hamlets offering at least partial shelter and some supplies. Though much of the farmland lay under snow, the travelers found enough to supplement their dwindling stocks. As word spread that the Night King had been defeated, villagers and wandering hunters approached the column in awe. Some knelt in the snow before Daenerys, calling her the Dragon Queen and offering what meager thanks they could. Children peered at Drogon and Rhaegal with wide-eyed wonder. Despite the dragon's injuries, they remained fearsome symbols of Daenerys' power, and living proof that the Targaryen legacy of Dragonfire had triumphed over the greatest darkness. Every night, Daenerys took time to see to the dragons herself, cleaning their wounds, tending them with the maester's guidance. The beasts accepted her touch, though they growled if anyone else grew too bold. Their golden eyes never lost that spark of intelligence, reminding her that dragons were no mere animals. She whispered to them in the old tongue, promising them rest and warmth once they reached Winterfell. Drogon, especially, seemed to search her face with a questioning look, as if reassuring himself that the cold presence in her mind was truly gone. She stroked his scales and felt only the pulse of her own warmth in response. Jon, meanwhile, led patrols to scout for any stray pockets of undead, though they found none. The occasional pile of bones was all that remained of wights that had collapsed when the Night King perished. Each day that passed without encountering more horrors renewed the sense of cautious optimism in the group. The living had won. They were free to look beyond mere survival now. Still, the column's mood was tempered by mourning. They held solemn vigils for those lost, lighting candles or small pyres when wood was available. Daenerys participated in these rites, speaking softly of valor, ensuring that the dead received the dignity they deserved. She watched as soldiers of different houses shared their grief in communal silence, and it struck her how unity had been forged on this journey. House banners meant little when all had faced annihilation together. Perhaps that unity could persist, she thought, if she nurtured it carefully. One evening, they found a partially intact keep on the outskirts of the last hearth, once held by House Umber. The keep had been damaged when the undead marched south. Now it stood abandoned in the snow. They chose to camp within its courtyard for the night, grateful for the stone walls that blocked the wind. As Daenerys stepped through the old gates, she recalled how the Umbers had once pledged fealty to House Stark. The cycle of betrayal and recaptured loyalty in the north had been complicated, but in this war, House Umber had paid a high price. She passed through the keep's halls, seeing signs of struggle, scorch marks, scattered debris, an eerie hush. Jon and Arya explored separately, ensuring no hidden dangers lurked within. Eventually, they reconvened in a large hall that still had a partially intact roof. A few stones had collapsed into a corner, letting in patches of sky. There, they lit a large fire in the central hearth. Grey Worm and the Unsullied gathered, forming a perimeter. Arya leaned against a cold pillar, scanning the darkness with watchful eyes. Davos warmed his hands by the fire, occasionally stirring the pot of thin stew simmering on the coals. Daenerys sat close to Jon, feeling the ache of the journey in her muscles. "How does your arm fare?" Arya asked quietly, glancing at Daenerys. Though Arya's tone was direct, there was a hint of concern behind her reserved demeanor. Daenerys shifted her shoulder under the cloak. The bandages were snug, and the pain had dulled to a persistent throb. "It mends," she answered. "Thanks to the Maester's poultices. I'll heal." Arya nodded, then turned her gaze to the flickering flames. Daenerys studied the younger woman's face in the firelight and thought she detected relief. Whatever doubts Arya had once held about Daenerys, the battle against the dead had changed perspectives. Arya's eyes reflected the dancing fire, revealing the memory of all she had witnessed. The conversation that night drifted around small matters: rationing, watch schedules, speculation about the roads ahead. Though Daenerys was quiet, her mind churned. She wondered how the North would greet them. Would Sansa be waiting at the gates of Winterfell with a warm reception, or with a measured distance? Would Tyrion have kept the realm calm, Or had new troubles arisen in their absence? She recalled how she had left King's Landing in ruins after the bitter war with Cersei. The city had begun rebuilding, but tension had lingered. She had declared a new era free from tyranny, but the scars ran deep. Some lords had rallied to her cause, while others begrudged her the destruction wrought during the final stages of that conflict. Then the Night King's threat had overshadowed everything, forcing the realm to unite, at least in part. Now, with that threat gone, the lingering resentments could reemerge. Yet as she gazed around at the battered company, unsullied, northerners, wildlings, she recognized a bond forged in the ice and darkness. Perhaps that bond could serve as the foundation for a more peaceful future. She thought about the dream she had once had, standing in the throne room of the Red Keep, the roof broken open, snow falling all around. That vision had haunted her, seeming a harbinger of doom. But snow could also symbolize a new beginning, cleansing away the old. Perhaps that was the meaning she needed to embrace. When dawn came, they resumed their journey. Each day brought them closer to Winterfell, and Daenerys felt a new flutter of nerves. She had come north as the powerful Dragon Queen, but now she returned not only as a victor over the Night King, but as a wounded survivor. Would the Northern Lords see her differently? Would the realm? She resolved to show them that her devotion had not diminished, that the spark of her vision for a better world remained alive. At last, on a day when the sky hung low with slate-gray clouds, the riders at the head of the column spied the familiar towers of Winterfell rising from the rolling winter plains. A horn sounded, a brassy note echoing over the snow. Soldiers inside the castle bustled, forming up at the battlements to catch a glimpse of those returning. Daenerys guided her horse forward, ignoring the twinge in her arm. Drogon and Regal, exhausted but steadier on their feet, let out guttural calls that carried across the open fields. As they drew nearer, Daenerys noticed the gates were wide open in welcome rather than closed in distrust. Figures stood at the threshold. She recognized Sansa Stark's distinctive red hair, her posture regal despite the swirl of wind around her. Tyrion was there as well, dressed in a heavy cloak, scanning the returning ranks with anxious eyes. The courtyard beyond was filled with people. Soldiers, small folk, and more. Some looked awed, others simply relieved at the sight of their queen and her forces, battered but alive. When Daenerys, Jon, and the leading group finally passed under Winterfell's gate, a hush fell over the onlookers. The watchers took in the injuries, the bandaged arms and legs, the ragged banners. Daenerys dismounted slowly. Jon did the same beside her, passing the reins to a waiting stable hand. She saw Sansa advancing, flanked by Brienne of Tarth and a few other northern retainers. Tyrion walked at her side, a mixture of worry and relief on his face. Sansa paused a few paces away. Her gaze flicked to Jon first, scanning him for injuries. Then she looked to Daenerys, her eyes lingering on the queen's bandaged shoulder. She inclined her head slightly, the gesture carefully measured. "Welcome home," she said, her voice clear enough for those nearby to hear. And though there was still a reserve in her expression, Daenerys sensed a genuineness in the words. "We heard rumors that the dead had been defeated, but we didn't dare hope until we saw you." Daenerys exchanged a quick look with Jon. Then she gave Sansa a slight nod, measured but sincere. "It's done," she said simply. "The Night King is destroyed. His army fell with him. None remain of the undead host." An audible exhalation rippled through the crowd. Some began murmuring prayers of thanks, while others stared at the returning warriors in awe. Tyrion stepped forward, eyeing Daenerys' wound. "I trust there's no lingering complications?" he asked quietly, lips pursed. The question was pointed, given what they all knew about the Night King's attempts to corrupt her. Daenerys managed a small, reassuring smile. "None," she replied. "He's gone, truly gone." She looked around, noticing the mixture of hope and trepidation on the faces of Winterfell's people. "We've suffered losses," she said, raising her voice so they could hear. "Great losses, but we have survived the long night. Let us honor those who fell, and ensure their sacrifice was not in vain." A rumble of agreement swept the courtyard. Some wore tears on their cheeks. Others nodded gravely. In their eyes, Daenerys saw that their old suspicions of a dragon queen had softened, replaced by a tired gratitude. For many, the memory of the undead hordes overshadowed all lesser feuds. The realm had been pulled back from the brink of oblivion, and Daenerys Targaryen was a large part of that salvation. Sansa signaled for the gates to be shut against the winter wind, and the returning company was ushered into the great hall for warmth and respite. There, fires roared in the large hearths, and tables had been set with bread, stews, and ale. What little the North could spare. Daenerys removed her gloves and cloak, wincing at the stiffness in her arm, as the maester checked on her wound once more. Jon drifted into a quiet conversation with Sansa, while Tyrion hovered near Daenerys, ensuring she had everything she needed. Soon, the great hall filled with the bustle of the injured being tended, the hungry devouring their first proper hot meal in days, and the rest simply seeking the comfort of a roof overhead. Grey Worm organized the Unsullied in their familiar disciplined ranks, some at rest, others posted as sentries to keep order. Arya vanished in her quiet way, presumably to reconnect with her sister or to see to her own business. Amid this swirl, Sansa returned to Daenerys' side. She studied the queen carefully, as if noticing the new lines of exhaustion etched into Daenerys' face. "I'm sorry for your losses," Sansa said, a note of genuine sympathy weaving through her typical guardedness. "We've all lost too many, but we're grateful you have returned." Daenerys inclined her head, meeting Sansa's gaze. She recalled their earlier tensions, how the Lady of Winterfell had doubted her intentions and her claims. But now Daenerys saw a flicker of acceptance. "We will remember them," Daenerys said. "All of them, Northmen, Dothraki, Unsullied, everyone who fought and died. The wall can be rebuilt, houses restored, but not the lives taken. We must honor them by building the peace they never had the chance to see." Sansa nodded. She glanced around the hall, clearly noticing how the Northmen and the Targaryen soldiers mingled. No open hostilities, just a subdued sense of unity forged by shared trauma. "Peace," she echoed. "I hope we can find it now." Later that evening, Daenerys and her closest advisors gathered in a smaller chamber off the main hall, seeking privacy to discuss the next steps. The room's walls were thick, blocking much of the noise from the feasting. A long table dominated the center, a half-burnt map of the North spread across it. Jon, Sansa, Tyrion, Davos, and Grey Worm were there, along with Brienne of Tarth and a handful of other key figures. The mood was subdued but determined. Tyrion cleared his throat. "Reports from across the realm have trickled in," he began, glancing at Daenerys. "With the Night King's threat overshadowing everything, we had a tenuous truce. Now, we may face unrest from those who question the future. The Crownlands are still rebuilding after the last war. The Stormlands have scattered leadership, with Lord Gendry Baratheon doing his best to gather support. The Reach remains under the uncertain stewardship of House Tarly, though many question the allegiance after Randall Tarly's betrayal. Dorne is quiet, but we've heard no definitive news of a new prince or princess taking formal control." Sansa folded her hands on the table. "And the North? We've done all we can to protect our borders. People are weary, hungry, but relieved the threat is gone. They'll look to us for direction. They'll want to know what role House Stark will play in the wider realm, especially if House Targaryen reasserts control in King's Landing." Daenerys rubbed the bandage on her arm, feeling the sting of the salve beneath. "I do intend to reestablish order," she said, her tone calm but resolute. "But I will not repeat the mistakes of the past. I will not rule by terror or by burning cities. I've done things I regret in the heat of war. Now I want to heal these lands. They have suffered enough." Jon nodded, looking around the table. "The question is how to unite everyone under this vision. We've seen how quickly lords can revert to petty struggles once an overarching threat is gone. We need a stable approach. One realm under one ruler, but with respect for the autonomy of each region." Tyrion tapped his fingers on the table. "A great council might be the answer, one that brings lords from each major region to decide on the shape of governance. Many lords who once opposed Daenerys may be swayed now, seeing that she risked everything to defeat the dead. But there are still plenty who remember the destruction in King's Landing. Sansa's lips pressed into a thin line. They'll want reassurance. Promises that the mistakes of the past won't be repeated. She paused. Even here in the north, there are those who fear that the Targaryen temperament is prone to extremes. They'll need to see a different side of you. Daenerys faced her directly. They will see it, she promised, her voice soft but intense. The war for the living changed me. I felt the cold hand of death on my mind, and I know how precious life is. I want a realm where no one lives in fear of tyrants, of white walkers, of slavers. I want them to be free. Grey Worm, silent until now, inclined his head. The Unsullied stand behind you, my queen, he said, voice carrying the trace of heartbreak from Missandei's loss. We will follow you wherever you go, to build this peace you speak of. Davos spoke up. I've seen how war tears us apart, but I've also seen the good that can arise when we put aside differences. People are tired, my queen. If you offer them a chance to rebuild, they'll flock to it, so long as they trust you. Jon let out a slow breath. Trust may take time, but we can start here. Winterfell is the symbolic heart of the North. If the North stands with Daenerys, that sends a powerful message. Then we can extend that unity to the rest of the kingdoms. Sansa's gaze dropped to the table. She seemed to weigh Jon's words carefully, recalling her own experiences with the North's independence and its proud traditions. I believe the North can stand with Daenerys, she said finally, her voice measured. But we need to consult with the other houses, hold an assembly. Once they see that the undead threat is over and that we owe a debt to the queen who helped save us, many will come around. Daenerys inclined her head in gratitude. She recognized how difficult it was for Sansa to yield any degree of northern autonomy, but they both understood the necessity. Then let us proceed, Daenerys said, glancing around. We'll stabilize Winterfell and the north, and from here we'll reach out to the rest of Westeros. A great council, if that is what's needed, to formalize the realm under a single peaceful rule. Tyrion's face lightened fractionally, as though a burden had lifted. It's a wise course, he said. We can't simply march south expecting everyone to bend the knee, not after all that has happened. We must invite them to the table, and show them we are not the same realm that once erupted in civil war. With that, the meeting dissolved into practical arrangements. They would send ravens to major houses, requesting representatives to come to Winterfell for a grand summit. The tasks of feeding and housing so many guests would strain resources, but if the event went well, it would establish Daenerys' new approach. For the time being, they would remain in Winterfell while the dragons healed and the roads cleared of remaining snowdrifts. Over the following weeks, a sense of cautious hope spread through Winterfell. The arrival of ravens bearing Daenerys' personal seal and Sansa Stark's endorsement made many lords pause and reconsider their allegiances. Some wrote back at once, agreeing to send envoys to the proposed council. Others lodged concerns or demands. A few remained silent, their intentions unknown. Daenerys, for her part, found a strange peace in the daily routines of governance. She walked the battlements with Jon, greeting soldiers on watch. She visited the forges where Gendry hammered out new tools rather than dragonglass weapons. She sat in on audiences with northern bannermen, who came to pay respects or raise issues about border security and famine relief. Sansa and Tyrion guided her in navigating northern customs, ensuring that each house felt acknowledged. Sometimes late at night, Daenerys would stand by the brazier in her chamber, recalling the dreamlike terror of the Night King's invasions into her mind. She would trace the bandaged scar on her arm, now mostly healed but still tender, and remind herself how close she had come to losing her very soul to ice. In those moments, she remembered to be grateful for the chance to shape a new world. The horrors of the long night remained an ever-present caution, that if the realm stayed divided, if old feuds festered, they might invite ruin again, whether from external threats or from within. With each passing day, the dragons regained strength. Drogon's wound closed, leaving a deep scar across his shoulder. Rhaegal's torn wing membrane knitted, though the dragon was still cautious in his flights. Daenerys took them into the skies in short, careful stretches above Winterfell's walls, so they did not forget the sensation of open air. Whenever they roared, it drew crowds in the courtyard, some wide-eyed in awe, others cheering softly for the creatures that had helped save them. Jon would ride regal, albeit with lingering worry about the dragon's healing injuries. Slowly, the bond between him and Regal deepened. Daenerys watched them with a faint, proud smile, recognizing that the Targaryen blood in Jon made the dragons accept him in a way they never had with others. There was no jealousy in her heart, only relief. They would need every alliance they could forge, man and beast alike, to maintain peace in Westeros. The time eventually came for the First Lords to arrive for the proposed council. The great hall buzzed with preparations. Fresh rushes were laid, banners cleaned, and extra tables set. Though Winterfell lacked the grandeur of the Red Keep, it possessed a solemn dignity that underscored the seriousness of this gathering. House Manderly, House Serwyn, House Glover, and several others from the north arrived in a steady procession. From the Riverlands came representatives of House Tully and smaller vassals. Rumor reached them that a royal fleet from the Crownlands was on its way, escorted by what remained of the Royal Navy, a fragile coalition mostly manned by new recruits since the old fleet had burned during the wars. Daenerys braced herself, dressed in warm northern garments that combined her house colors with local furs. She stood on the dais beside Sansa, Jon, and Tyrion, greeting each arriving party with measured courtesy. Some bowed deeply, others gave only a stiff nod. Yet none openly challenged her presence or her authority. The memory of the undead invasion was too fresh, and the rumors of how Daenerys and her dragons had slain the Night King spread like wildfire. Over the next few days, the Great Hall hosted a series of tense but constructive discussions. Lords voiced concerns about famine in the Reach, the remnants of Euron Greyjoy's scattered Ironborn raiders, the uncertain leadership in Dorne, and the question of succession in various houses ravaged by war. Daenerys listened more than she spoke. She sensed that the lords needed to see she respected their voices rather than dictating from above. Tyrion's sharp mind proved invaluable. He navigated the labyrinth of claims, grievances, and alliances with deft skill. Sansa's presence reassured the northern contingent that their interests would not be trampled. Jon offered a sense of moral gravity, reminding everyone of the greater good they had fought for. One point of contention simmered beneath the surface: Daenerys' claim to the Iron Throne, and by extension, Jon's potential claim as a secret Targaryen. A few lords eyed Jon and Daenerys curiously, suspecting there was more to their partnership than mere alliance. But the matter remained unspoken in the early sessions, overshadowed by more pressing logistical issues. Daenerys herself avoided announcing anything about lineage, focusing on forging a stable, united front. At times, she caught subtle glimpses of the old suspicions. A sideways glance when she talked about reorganizing the crown's finances, a stiffening posture when she mentioned how the Targaryen dragons would safeguard the kingdom's frontiers. But those tensions never burst into open defiance. The image of her riding into the heart of ice and emerging victorious was potent. No matter their reservations, the lords knew Westeros owed her a debt that transcended politics. Still, the gathered lords demanded an answer about what shape the monarchy would take. They could not simply assume everything would proceed as before. Some championed the idea of a limited monarchy with regional autonomy. Others insisted on a single, strong ruler to maintain order. A few radical voices murmured about a possible return to the old northern independence, but Sansa and Jon were quick to remind them of the unity that had saved them from the undead. One evening, after a particularly lengthy debate, Daenerys took a solitary walk along the top of Winterfell's walls. Snow drifted from the sky, coating the parapets in a thin layer of white. Her breath billowed in the cold air. She found her thoughts wandering to the house of the undying visions, of the throne room open to the sky, of the wind carrying echoes of dragons. Now, after all that had happened, she was standing in the north with real snow drifting about her, forging a new path for the Seven Kingdoms. The poetry of it was not lost on her, yet the reality was far more complex. The price of peace was not simply removing a tyrant from the throne. It was forging a system that could endure after she was gone. She leaned her hands on the cold stone, scanning the horizon. Tomorrow, she would need to address the council directly about her vision for the realm. She had to show them that the Targaryen ambition, once associated with dragons and conquest, could become something more benevolent. She heard footsteps behind her and turned to see Jon approaching, wrapped in a thick cloak. He joined her at the parapet, gazing out over the snowy fields. "Hard to believe," he said quietly, "that not long ago, this land was besieged by the dead. Now we worry about taxes and trade routes." Daenerys let out a faint laugh. "Life goes on even after the darkest nights," she replied, though she sounded a touch wistful. "I'm still adjusting to it. No more nightmares, no more phantom cold in my thoughts." Jon placed a hand on her arm. "I'm glad you're free of it." He paused, searching her face. "Tomorrow you'll lay out your plan for the realm. Whatever you decide, I stand with you." She studied him. She knew that, in the eyes of some lords, his own claim to the throne might complicate matters. But the realm had little appetite for another succession war. "I won't keep secrets about your lineage forever," she said softly. "But maybe we don't need to publicly announce it either. At least not yet. Let us first show them we can govern together." He nodded in agreement. "We need to give the people peace. That's what matters most. I've never wanted the throne, but I won't hide the truth when the time comes." Her heart felt a pang of gratitude and love for the man who had risked his life time and again, who had stood at her side in the battle against impossible odds. She touched the scar on her arm, remembering how close she had come to falling into the Night King's grasp. Sometimes, late at night, she wondered if a piece of that cold still lodged in her soul. But if so, Jon's presence, and the presence of those who cared about her, kept it at bay. The next morning, Daenerys donned a formal but practical dress of dark fabric trimmed with red. She took her place in the Great Hall, flanked by Jon, Tyrion, and Sansa. The lords and ladies of the realm, those who had arrived thus far, arrayed themselves at long tables. The sunlight drifting through the high windows glinted off steel helms and the occasional bit of jewelry. Murmurs rolled through the hall as Daenerys stood, commanding attention with a gesture of her hand. "My lords and ladies," she began, voice carrying clearly, "you have come to Winterfell in the wake of the greatest threat our world has known. A threat we faced together and vanquished. We have all paid dearly. The wars of men, the war against the dead, the destruction and the grief. These must be the last we endure in this generation. Westeros deserves a chance to heal." The crowd quieted, listening. Daenerys continued, pacing slowly before them, her footsteps echoing on the stone floor. "I claim the throne by blood and by right," she said. "Yet I do not desire to be a queen of ash and death. I have seen what that path leads to, and I reject it. We have an opportunity now to rebuild, to shape a realm where justice and freedom are not just words but realities. I do not stand here to demand fealty with fire and sword. I stand here to ask your partnership in forging a new order, one that respects each region's ways, yet remains united against threats from within and without." She glanced at Tyrion, who nodded in encouragement. "I propose a great council to formalize this," Daenerys said. "One that will help shape laws, mediate disputes between regions, and ensure that no ruler can act with unchecked brutality. As queen, I will honor the traditions of each region, so long as we maintain unity. Let the North keep its identity. The Iron Islands chart their path under the realm's protection. Dorne uphold its customs. But let us have a common cause that binds us together." A ripple of reaction passed through the hall. Some looked surprised, others intrigued. She could see a few lords exchanging glances, no doubt calculating how such a council would shift power dynamics. But she pressed on, her voice steady. "In time, I will journey to each region, not with armies at my back, but with open hands for rebuilding. The horrors we faced in the north remind us that humanity must stand as one. We cannot afford endless strife between great houses." She let silence fill the hall for a moment. Then Tyrion spoke, adding his carefully weighted words about the practicality of such a council, how it could prevent future rebellions, how it might promote trade and prosperity. Sansa followed, her voice carrying the firm ring of the North's endorsement, though she carefully couched it in terms of an alliance that benefited both sides. Jon said little but stood at Daenerys' side, a quiet testament to his support. Questions followed, of course. Some lords asked about the scope of the council's authority, about who would sit on it, about finances and taxes. Daenerys answered as best she could, acknowledging that details would need to be hammered out, but promising that no region's concerns would be dismissed. She repeated her vow not to burn or pillage rebellious provinces. If conflict arose, it would be addressed by negotiation wherever possible. In that promise, she laid bare her desire to avoid repeating the tragic mistakes that had plagued her recent past. Over the course of the day, the mood in the hall shifted from suspicion to cautious optimism. Lords and ladies from across the realm saw, in Daenerys' measured approach, a break from the cycles of tyranny and civil war. It did not mean all were entirely convinced. Some likely planned to secure advantages, to test the boundaries of this new arrangement. But the immediate result was acceptance. They would try. They had no stomach left for war. The queen who slew the Night King, who nearly lost her life to protect the living, deserved a chance to lead in peace. That evening, a more celebratory feast was held. It was not lavish by the standards of King's Landing, but it was spirited in a way that Winterfell had not seen in a long time. Fresh ale flowed, the kitchens prepared as many hearty dishes as supplies allowed, and minstrels played subdued but hopeful tunes. Daenerys moved among the guests, speaking with them directly. She listened to stories of lost sons, burned farmlands, or uncertain futures. She offered sympathy, promising reconstruction efforts and sending ravens to the capital for resources. Tyrion, as her hand, made careful notes of each request, adding to the ongoing ledger of what would be needed once they returned to the southern seats of power. Jon mingled as well, quietly receiving the thanks of northern lords who remembered how he had once commanded the Night's Watch or served as king in the north. Some teased him for giving up that crown, while others clapped his shoulder in gratitude for forging an alliance with Daenerys. A few, bolder, asked pointed questions about the closeness between him and the queen, but Jon offered no more than a polite, non-committal smile. The dragons, sensing the more vibrant energy of the night, rumbled from the courtyard. They were not inside the hall, but the orange glow of torches occasionally illuminated their large silhouettes near the walls. People drifted out in small groups to marvel at them, though a line of Unsullied kept a respectful distance. Children, especially, stared in wide-eyed awe, giggling when Drogon puffed a small spurt of flame into the cold air. Daenerys, hearing their laughter through a half-open door, smiled softly to herself. This was a far cry from the terror that had once accompanied the mention of dragons. As the night progressed, the tension in Daenerys' shoulders eased, replaced by a cautious sense of hope. She sipped a cup of warm, spiced wine, ignoring the faint ache in her healing arm. All around, she saw faces that had once been etched in fear now were small smiles. The memory of ice and death still lingered, but for the first time in ages, it felt as if Westeros was leaning toward a gentler tomorrow. Much later, when the hall began to thin out and only the most spirited guests remained, Daenerys slipped away to her chamber. She extinguished the lanterns, leaving only a single candle by her bedside. The flickering flame cast dancing shadows on the walls. She sat on the edge of the bed, exhaling a long, tired breath. It had been an arduous road, filled with tragedy and near despair, but she was here, alive, free from the Night King's corruption, forging a new realm. A soft rap at the door made her raise her head. She bid the person enter, and Jon stepped in, closing the door quietly behind him. He offered a slight smile, the weariness in his eyes mirroring her own. "You handled them well," he said. "I heard House Manderly praising your willingness to listen. That's a feat in itself." She set the wine cup aside and stood, facing him. "We've come so far," she said softly. "Sometimes I can barely comprehend it all." He stepped closer, searching her eyes. "You saved us," he murmured, as though reaffirming that truth. "Whatever the future holds, We owe you that." Daenerys shook her head. "We saved each other," she said, remembering how Jon had knocked the Night King off balance in that final moment, how all of them, Unsullied, Northerners, the dragons, had played a part. "I couldn't have done it alone." He lifted a hand to brush a strand of hair from her face. The candlelight flickered, casting warmth across his features. They shared a quiet moment, a fragile intimacy that had been denied them during the chaos of war. When he gently leaned in, she met him halfway, their lips coming together in a soft, unhurried kiss. The taste of spiced wine mingled between them, and for the span of a heartbeat, the burdens of crowns and councils evaporated. Daenerys let herself savor his presence, the warmth of his hands, the reassuring solidity of his arms around her. She recalled how close she had come to a cold oblivion, how the Night King's voice had whispered, urging her to surrender. Now, she felt Jon's breath against her cheek, his life and warmth anchoring her. The candle flickered, and she broke the kiss gently, resting her forehead against his. "I want to build a world where such moments aren't stolen between wars," she said quietly, eyes drifting shut. "Where we can breathe without wondering if the dead or the living will tear us apart." Jon's arms tightened around her. "Then we'll build it," he whispered, voice thick with conviction. "We'll build it together." That night, she slept without nightmares. The hush of Winterfell after the festivities, the gentle crackle of the last embers in the hearth, the steady rhythm of Jon's breathing. These were her lullabies. She dreamt of open skies, of dragons gliding over fields of green rather than frozen wastes, of children cheering instead of screaming. In that dream, the ghosts of war receded to the edges of her mind, replaced by a quiet dawn. The days that followed were a blur of diplomatic efforts. More lords arrived, some from as far as the Westerlands and the Vale, each with their own demands and offers. The Great Council slowly took shape. They debated how seats would be assigned, how often it would convene, and how its decisions would be enforced. Daenerys negotiated carefully, ensuring no single region felt marginalized. She recognized that trust could be fragile. If one house perceived favoritism, it could unravel the entire effort. All the while, the realm beyond Winterfell buzzed with rumors. The Dragon Queen lived, the Night King was destroyed, the war is over. Common folk whispered that Daenerys Targaryen carried some blessing of the gods to have defeated such an ancient evil. Others claimed that she had nearly been taken by the darkness, only to break free at the last moment. The truth of that struggle would never be fully known outside her closest circle, but it fed the sense of mystique surrounding her. When word arrived that ships from King's Landing had docked on the eastern coast, ferrying men loyal to the crown, Daenerys felt a pang of anticipation. These men were the old guard of the capital, some who had served the Lannisters, some now sworn to the Targaryen line. Their presence signaled that the seat of power was shifting in earnest toward Daenerys's vision. She braced herself for the possible friction with northern lords who bristled at the presence of southern soldiers. But no major conflict erupted. People were simply too weary for more bloodshed. Slowly, the lines of division that had once carved Westeros into fractious bits began to blur. In the courtyards, knights from the Westerlands trained alongside northern spearmen, forging a camaraderie unthinkable a few years prior. The forges clanged day and night, not crafting weapons for a new war but replacing tools lost to the snows and forging steel for the upkeep of roads, wagons, and plows. Daenerys saw blacksmiths from different regions trading techniques, welders from the Reach, famed for intricate metalwork, instructing younger apprentices from the north on new methods. It was a hopeful sign of what she meant by forging unity. Amid this bustling progress, Daenerys discovered a few quiet hours in the Godswood. The ancient heart tree's red leaves rustled in the winter breeze, its face carved with solemn vigilance. She walked there in the snowy hush, reflecting on all that had passed. It reminded her of the first time she set foot in Winterfell, uncertain of her reception. She had come with dragons and unsullied armies, but the Godswood had been a place of northern memory stretching back thousands of years. Now she felt a certain kinship with these old roots and silent watchers. Fire and ice, meeting under the same sky. Bran Stark often sat near the weirwood, his eyes distant with the knowledge of the three-eyed raven. Daenerys approached him one afternoon, footfalls muffled by the snow, stopping a respectful distance away. He turned his head slightly, as if sensing her presence before she spoke. "You see more than any of us," Daenerys said softly. "Do you see a future for the realm we're trying to build?" Bran's voice was calm, almost ethereal. "Time flows in many currents, Daenerys Targaryen. You and Jon have altered a great tide by destroying the Night King. Now the realm stands at a crossroad. Yes, there is a future, but futures can branch and twist. You must stay true to what you've begun." She considered his words. "Is there still a threat we should fear? Another darkness?" Bran's pale eyes flickered as though he peered into invisible distances. "The scars left by the long night will not vanish overnight. Greed, ambition, and cruelty are part of man's nature. If you falter or turn from your principles, that darkness can take root in different forms. But the ancient threat of the others is ended. That is one victory you can carry forward." Daenerys exhaled, relief tempered by the knowledge that human conflicts would always persist. "Thank you, Bran," she said simply. He inclined his head in acknowledgement, and Daenerys turned to leave him to his solitude. She realized that he lived in a realm half in the present, half in visions of past and future, a guardian of memory. That memory would be crucial if they were to avoid repeating the mistakes of old. Winter grudgingly began to recede as the weeks turned into months. Storms lessened, roads cleared, and supply wagons moved more freely. The great council sessions continued, gradually shaping the blueprint of a new political order. Daenerys made it clear that while she accepted the crown, she would work alongside a body of representatives. The lords hammered out details of how to select these representatives, some by birth, others by acclaim or election within each region, a radical notion for many. Tensions flared occasionally, but the desire to avoid another war kept discussions civil. During this period, Daenerys spent a portion of her days reading old histories, guided by Samwell Tarly, who arrived from the Citadel carrying texts seldom seen in the north. They pored over treatises on Valyrian governance, on the structure of old Targaryen courts, even accounts of how the Children of the Forest and the First Men had forged the original pact. She took inspiration from the idea that once mortal enemies had set aside differences to unify. If that ancient example could echo now, perhaps they could create something enduring. One crisp morning, she and Jon took flight on their dragons, Drogon and Rhaegal now strong enough to ride the skies without fear of reopening wounds. They soared above Winterfell, the wind tugging at Daenerys' hair. Below them, the castle's walls glinted in the winter sun. Plumes of smoke from hearth fires rose lazily, a sign that life and warmth thrived within. Daenerys felt a swell of emotion. In earlier years, she had dreamed only of reclaiming King's Landing. Yet Winterfell had become a symbol of a new home, a place where alliances were forged in the crucible of a shared fight for survival. She glanced over at Jon, who guided Rhaegal with a sure hand. His fur-lined cloak billowed behind him, his expression one of quiet wonder as he took in the wide expanse of the north. Together, they banked westward, following the line of the King's Road for a short while, glancing down at caravans that inched along the thawing track. Farmers and merchants looked up, momentarily startled to see dragons overhead, then broke into cheers or uncertain waves. It was a far cry from the terror that once accompanied a dragon's silhouette on the horizon. They circled back to Winterfell and landed in the courtyard, where a crowd had gathered to watch. Children clapped and jumped at the spectacle. A few goats bleated in panic from their enclosures, but overall, the mood was joyous. Daenerys slid off Drogon, patting his side. Jon dismounted Rhaegal, giving the dragon a grateful scratch under the jaw. Someone in the crowd cheered, and the sentiment caught on, rolling into a spontaneous applause. Daenerys felt her cheeks warm in a rare flush. She gave a slight bow of her head to the onlookers, then moved aside to let the dragons settle. In the weeks that followed, lords from distant corners of the realm began to trickle away from Winterfell, returning to their lands to implement or discuss the new arrangements. Many left with guarded optimism, carrying tidings of Daenerys' approach to governance. A few openly praised her for ending the threat of the dead and offering a gentler hand than many had expected. Others maintained a cautious neutrality, waiting to see if the promises of the Great Council would bear fruit. Daenerys and her advisors decided that she, Jon, and a select entourage would travel south to inspect the damage in King's Landing and hold court there. The city, still reeling from the wars, needed attention. They also wanted to show the realm that the capital was not forgotten, that it would become a seat of inclusive rule rather than a fortress of tyranny. Sansa remained in Winterfell, reaffirming Stark guardianship of the North. Tyrion, Davos, and Grey Worm joined Daenerys. Arya chose to stay behind with her family for a time, though she promised she might visit King's Landing later, out of curiosity rather than duty. On the appointed day of departure, a crisp dawn greeted them. Daenerys, dressed in practical traveling attire trimmed with her dragon sigil, stood in the courtyard. Drogon and Rhaegal loomed behind her, saddled with supplies for a flight south. A column of unsullied and northern soldiers mounted on horseback prepared to ride alongside the caravans that would bring further provisions. Jon was at her side, harnessing Rhaegal's reins. Sansa approached, flanked by Brienne of Tarth. The Lady of Winterfell paused before Daenerys, her expression calm, though a hint of sadness flickered in her eyes. "Safe travels," she said. "We'll keep the north secure, and we'll see that the council's decisions are followed here. I trust you'll do the same in the south." Daenerys inclined her head. "Thank you, Sansa. I know you'll guard these people well. I look forward to the day when we can stand together again, in a realm fully at peace." Sansa offered a small, genuine smile. "Take care of our brother," she said, casting a brief look at Jon. "He has a habit of running headlong into danger." Jon let out a quiet, half-amused breath. "I'll try to exercise caution this time," he said, leaning over to embrace Sansa. The two Stark siblings held each other for a moment, the memory of all their losses and triumphs passing between them in silence. When they parted, Daenerys laid a hand on Drogon's flank. The massive dragon bent low, allowing her to climb into the saddle. She felt the warmth of his body through her gloves, heard the low rumble of his breath. For a moment, she recalled the deadly synergy they had shared in fighting the Night King, fire against ice. Now, she hoped to use that fire for rebuilding, not destruction. Jon mounted Rhaegal, who let out a croon that echoed through the frosty air. The watchers in the courtyard stepped back as both dragons spread their wings. With a thunderous flap, they launched into the sky, the wind from their ascent buffeting cloaks and sending snow swirling. Below, the column of riders and wagons began to move out, escorted by the Unsullied. The people of Winterfell watched as two dragons and a new generation of leaders soared southward, carrying the promise of a united realm. Daenerys guided Drogon higher, the castle shrinking beneath them. The crisp air stung her face, but she welcomed it as a sign of life. The sun broke through the clouds, setting the snow-capped hills aglow. She glanced at Jon, who flew parallel on Rhaegal. He caught her eye, a faint smile crossing his features. They were no longer simply lovers or allies in a desperate war. They were partners in shaping the destiny of Westeros. A quiet sense of awe filled Daenerys at the thought. As they soared beyond the walls of Winterfell, the open sky beckoned. The north stretched behind them, a land battered by war and winter but unbroken in spirit. Ahead lay the green fields and battered cities of the south, a tapestry of peoples and histories waiting for a leadership that would not break them again. Daenerys Targaryen felt the weight of responsibility settle on her shoulders, but she did not falter. She carried with her the lessons of the long night, the memory of those who had fallen, and the fire within that refused to be snuffed out. They flew onward, dragons beating strong wings, forging a path across the skies of a realm that had seen too much darkness. Below them lay the promise of renewal, and in Daenerys' heart burned a single, unwavering conviction: that the bitter union of ice and fire had birthed a fragile but profound hope, one she would protect with every breath, so the living would never again bow to the horrors of the dead, nor to the tyranny of those who would abuse power. For the first time in a generation, the future of Westeros felt open, brimming with the possibilities that only peace and unity could bring. Daenerys Targaryen guided Drogon through the skies in a slow, southward glide, the dragon's mighty wings stirring the spring air into rolling currents beneath her. It had been weeks since she and Jon Snow had departed Winterfell, weeks of halting progress and cautious optimism as their small retinue picked its way toward King's Landing. Below them, the main column of soldiers, primarily unsullied, supplemented by a handful of northern volunteers, moved along muddy roads that cut through the southern plains. Wagon wheels creaked, and the soft clink of armor carried up even at this height, though the sounds were muffled against the steady rush of wind in Daenerys's ears. Jon rode a short distance away atop Rhaegal, guiding the dragon with care. Rhaegal's wing beats were slower than Drogon's, reflecting the lingering soreness from old wounds, but he soared nevertheless. Even from here, Daenerys could see the tension in Jon's shoulders ease whenever Rhaegal managed a smooth glide. Both dragons were healing, regaining their old strength day by day. The same might be said for the realm below them, raw, bruised, but beginning to heal in the aftermath of the long night and the wars preceding it. From the vantage of flight, Daenerys surveyed the terrain. Fields that had been under snow just weeks ago were now dotted with pale green shoots. Flakes of frost still dusted the edges of streams and ponds, but the melt was in full force, transforming once frozen rivers into rushing currents. The bite of the air was gentler than it had been in the north, and patches of wildflowers had begun to bloom where the ground was warm enough. It felt like the land itself was exhaling after the terror of the Night King's threat. Below, Tyrion Lannister and Davos Seaworth rode near the head of the column in a covered wagon, discussing final details of the capital's reconstruction, at least as much as they could plan without seeing the place firsthand. Grey Worm led the Unsullied's organized ranks on foot, always watchful, though they had encountered no armed resistance so far. Scouts had reported that the road was clear, small folk rebuilding huts and hamlets along the way. Many refugees, once fleeing the approach of the undead, were now returning to their homes, hauling carts with meager possessions. In those travelers' faces, Daenerys glimpsed relief and, at times, skepticism when they recognized her banners. But she met any wary gazes with a courteous nod or word, letting them see that the Mother of Dragons was no longer a bringer of destruction. It was a slow process of rebuilding trust. She guided Drogon lower, letting him skim above a broad meadow. The day was warm enough that she felt the sun's heat through her gloves. Peering ahead, she spotted a small village hugging the crossroads. Crude fences enclosed a few fields, and thin columns of smoke drifted from hastily mended rooftops. This settlement, the scouts had noted earlier, was known as Farrowford. Before the wars, it had been home to a few hundred souls, but most had fled or perished. Now, survivors had trickled back, determined to salvage what they could. She circled Drogon overhead, signaling Jon to land with her. They aimed for a relatively open expanse near a half-collapsed barn on the outskirts of the village. The sight of two dragons alighting was enough to send farm animals into a brief panic, goats and chickens scattering as a handful of villagers peered from behind broken doors. Smoke curled from Drogon's nostrils as he settled his bulk onto the ground with surprising delicacy. Rhaegal followed, stirring up a swirl of dust with each wing beat. Slowly, Daenerys slid from Drogon's saddle, landing with a muted thump in the dirt. Her boots squelched slightly in the muddy ground. She grimaced at the reminder that spring rains had turned many roads to muck, but set the thought aside and turned to meet the cluster of villagers that had begun to edge closer. Jon dismounted Rhaegal more cautiously, mindful of the dragon's still healing wing, and positioned himself at Daenerys' side. The villagers were a ragged group. Their clothing was patched, their faces lined by hardship. One man, wearing a battered leather jerkin, stepped forward, nervously clutching a hoe. Your Grace," he managed, attempting a bow. The gesture was awkward, more from exhaustion than disrespect. "We heard you were traveling south. Didn't know you'd pass near our fields." Daenerys offered a small smile, keeping her tone gentle. "I'm sorry if we startled you. We wanted to see how you fared after the winter." Are you managing? She glanced around the scattered huts and the broken fences, where new shoots of barley tried to emerge amid rubble. Jon nodded, adding quietly, "We've wagons of seed and some tools we can spare if you have need." That brought a flicker of cautious hope to the man's eyes, and murmurs rippled through the small group behind him. A few women and older men approached, scanning the dragons nervously. One older woman stepped forward, surprising Daenerys with the steadiness in her gaze. "We've heard tales that you beat back the undead," she said. "That the long nights ended and the Night King is gone. Is it true?" Daenerys nodded. "It is. The dead are gone and we've all begun to rebuild. We can help you if you are lacking seeds or supplies." The woman's expression wavered between relief and tears. "We lost nearly everything. My daughter, my son-in-law, but if you bring seeds, that's a start. We'll do the rest ourselves." Daenerys gestured to Jon. He gave a short, understanding nod, then lifted a hand to the column in the distance, signaling to have one of the supply wagons diverted. Within minutes, a pair of Unsullied arrived with small sacks of seed grain, a few spare farming tools, and rolled canvas that could be used to patch roofs. The villagers eyed the Unsullied spears warily at first, but the moment they saw the supplies being unloaded, the mood shifted from caution to something closer to gratitude. The older woman took a sack of barley from the soldiers, bowing her head in thanks. A younger man near her, perhaps a grandson, reached for a coil of rope with eager hands. He shot Daenerys a wide-eyed glance. We thought all you southern lords and queens forgot about us," he mumbled. "I'm from farther north than you realize," Jon said, a faint, wry tilt to his lips. The young man blinked, momentarily confused, then recognized Jon's features. A spark of awe flickered in his eyes at the realization he stood before both the king in the north, former king in the north at least, and the Dragon Queen. Daenerys read the mix of relief and lingering wariness in the villagers' faces, but at least it wasn't open hostility. She spent a short while walking amid the huts, gently inquiring about other needs: water wells, livestock, medical supplies. Jon did the same, kneeling down to inspect a broken fence with a pair of children who seemed fascinated by his cloak and the sword at his hip. As he reassured them that the dragons wouldn't eat them, an old rumor that had circulated through the countryside, Daenerys watched the children's eyes dart between him and the looming shapes of Drogon and Rhaegal. A tiny smile tugged at her mouth. This, she thought, was what she had hoped for. A realm no longer living in fear. Within the hour, the main column of soldiers caught up. Tyrion rode at the front, flanked by Davos and Grey Worm. When Tyrion spied the little scene, with the villagers receiving supplies under Daenerys' watchful eye, he gave her a subtle nod of approval. Grey Worm, however, remained vigilant, scanning the horizon for any sign of bandits or leftover brigands from the shattered Lannister forces. Thus far, the roads had proven relatively safe, thanks to the swift patrols Daenerys had dispatched from Winterfell weeks ago, but one could never be complacent. Eventually, Daenerys thanked the villagers for their time, wished them luck, and remounted Drogon. It took several mighty beats of his wings for the dragon to rise, stirring up dust and bits of straw, and she noticed the villagers flinch in awe. Jon ascended with Rhaegal behind her, and they pressed on. The supply wagons continued south as well, leaving behind enough goods to give that tiny hamlet a chance for a fresh start. They followed this pattern in the days ahead, stopping at small villages, listening to pleas, distributing a portion of the supplies meant for the capital. Some of Daenerys' advisors, particularly those from older, more traditional courts, might have once frowned upon handing out goods so freely. But neither she nor Jon cared to hoard their resources when the realm was in desperate need of rejuvenation. The quiet gratitude they saw reflected in the eyes of these survivors kindled Daenerys' determination to prove that she was not the same queen who had once, under the crushing sorrow of war, made ruthless decisions. If the realm needed healing, she would be the one to encourage it, not stand aloof. Little by little, the landscape changed. The further south they traveled, the more spring growth blossomed. Trees budded with bright green leaves, and in the distance, the outlines of gentle hills rose, patched with farmland, some tilled, others still in ruin from earlier conflicts. Villages were more populous here, with some roads showing signs of fresh repairs. The closer they got to the Crownlands, the more Daenerys felt the tingle of anticipation and worry. King's Landing had once been the center of her ambitions. Now it was a city half in ruins, forging its own path to recovery. At last, after nearly 3 weeks of methodical travel, they neared the outskirts of King's Landing. The city's walls rose in the distance, dark silhouettes against the pale sky. Over the past months, thousands of laborers had worked to clear rubble, rebuild shattered rooftops, and restore the city's main gates. Reports said that the city's population was slowly returning, though it was but a fraction of what it had been before the final war. Many of the more opulent mansions had been abandoned, scorched, or looted. Street children roamed areas once guarded by the city watch. And everywhere, people whispered about the Dragon Queen, who had delivered them from Cersei's tyranny and then faced down the Night King, but who had also, in her fury, left much of the capital blackened. Daenerys swallowed hard, recalling the last time she had been here in force, Drogon's flames raining on enemy troops and turning the tide of battle for good or ill. She remembered the day the bells had rung, the day she had made a terrible choice, fueled by heartbreak and the betrayal of her closest confidants. She had unleashed the dragons on a city that might have surrendered. The memory sat heavy in her chest. She understood that many would not welcome her with open arms, no matter her good intentions now. There had been too much bloodshed, too many ashes. Yet if she was to rule responsibly, she needed to face the city and the consequences of her actions. She adjusted her gloves, tightened her cloak against the mild breeze, and signaled Jon. They brought the dragons in lower, passing over the sprawl of fields and burnt farmland. Down below, the main column advanced along the Rose Road, now just a few miles from the city's gates. Tyrion had ridden ahead with an envoy to announce Daenerys' arrival, so presumably the city gates would open for them without confusion. As they drew nearer, Daenerys took in the sight of King's Landing from above. The Red Keep perched on a rocky promontory, still bearing the scars of collapsed towers and broken walls. The remains of the city's more modest neighborhoods arrayed around the bluff, many showing signs of reconstruction. The Great September was gone, destroyed by Cersei's wildfire long ago. In its place, a weed-choked field. She felt a pang for all the tragedies that had befallen King's Landing, some predating her arrival, others not. Drogon gave a low, guttural rumble, as though sensing her turmoil. She stroked his scales soothingly, guiding him toward an open courtyard near the ruined Red Keep. From the air, she could see wooden scaffolds erected around parts of the keep's walls, evidence that laborers were attempting repairs. The paint of newly replaced stones stood out in lighter shades compared to the old, soot-stained sections. Smoke from cook fires within the keep drifted up in thin columns, hinting that the place was occupied, likely by a skeleton crew of remaining administrators, guards, and workers. Nearby, she spied a broad clearing that used to be a training yard. That yard was now cleared of rubble, presumably to serve as a receiving area for her dragons. Daenerys noted the presence of a small gathering of armed men, a mixture of city watch and some of her loyal forces left behind when she marched north. She recognized a few banners featuring the Targaryen sigil, albeit tattered. Drogon descended, and Rhaegal followed. Even before they touched the ground, Daenerys saw the watchers below backpedal in awe, though no one fled outright. Clearly, they had been forewarned that the dragons were expected. She braced herself, preparing to meet the stares of these soldiers who might have uncertain loyalties. The moment Drogon's claws scraped the courtyard, dust swirled in a gritty cloud. Daenerys slid down, ignoring the knot in her stomach. Jon landed close by, hooking Rhaegal's reins to a heavy post hammered into the ground for that purpose. The dragon stretched its neck, sniffing at the rubble with a mix of curiosity and distaste. Daenerys patted Drogon's shoulder, wordlessly telling him to remain calm. Then she turned to face the gathered men, who had lowered their weapons in a gesture of respect. A few stepped forward, their faces a mixture of nerves and relief. "You've returned, Your Grace," said a man in a battered city watch helm. He removed it to reveal thinning hair and a heavy brow. We've kept the peace as best we could. Lord Tyrion said you'd be arriving soon. Daenerys glanced at the half-rebuilt walls around them, the fresh mortar contrasting with scorched stone. You've done well, she said evenly. I trust the city is stable? A slight hesitation. As stable as can be, my queen. He gestured for her to follow. We've had to put down a few riots over rations and deal with looters in the ruins. But for the most part, people want to rebuild. She nodded, stepping forward. Jon took a place beside her, scanning the courtyard. Over the far wall, they could hear the clatter of wagons and the shouts of the Unsullied as they began to arrive through the city gates. The streets outside likely thronged with curious onlookers, and a sense of tension prickled in the air. King's Landing had not seen Daenerys Targaryen since she had flown off to confront the undead in the north. Now she returned, triumphant over the Night King, yet burdened by old memories of her assault on the city. Daenerys took a measured breath and strode toward the partially collapsed Red Keep. She saw scaffolding around the courtyard's entrance, new beams supporting a precarious arch that had once been grand. Debris was cleared into neat piles, presumably awaiting disposal or salvage. Inside, the grand hall was little more than a charred skeleton. The roof had partially caved in, and the floor was cracked in places from fallen masonry. Workers paused their labor, turning to see the queen approach. And there, waiting amid the scaffolding, was Tyrion Lannister. He looked up from a scroll he had been reading and approached with a short bow. "Your Grace," he said, "welcome back to King's Landing, or what remains of it." Daenerys offered a small nod. "We've made it this far. Have you had word from the people?" Tyrion's mismatched eyes flicked to the workers, then back to her. "They're apprehensive, but they see you've arrived with wagons of supplies, not an army bent on further destruction. That will help." His tone was hopeful yet cautious. He gestured around the blackened stone. "We've made some progress clearing the worst of the rubble. The outer walls have been reinforced. There's a portion of the keep that is stable enough to serve as your living quarters. Far from luxurious, but safe." Jon stepped forward, scanning the chamber. "We'll start with safe," he said, voice quiet. "We'll have the men erect additional tents in the courtyard for the overflow, if needed." Tyrion nodded. "Indeed, we'll need to coordinate a day for the city's people to gather. Many want to see you in person to hear your plans. They've been told you return as a healer of the realm, but rumors persist. Some recall the fires that day the bells rang. Others only know you marched north to save them from the dead. The city is split between fear and gratitude." Daenerys lowered her gaze, recalling that day. The rush of rage and grief that had overcome her, the searing flames that had engulfed enemy soldiers, and some innocents as well. She still harbored guilt, a weight that pressed on her even as she resolved to atone. She looked back at Tyrion, schooling her voice to calm. "Then we must show them I am not here to reignite old horrors. Let them see what we've been doing, distributing supplies, offering reconstruction. Actions will speak louder than any speech." Tyrion looked relieved. "Quite so. I've prepared a list of tasks that need your authority to proceed: land grants, construction approvals, appointments to handle taxes. In short, you have a mountain of parchment awaiting your attention." Daenerys managed a thin smile. "I'll see to it after I've surveyed the city." Tyrion, have the workers focus on stabilizing living spaces first. Repairs to the throne room can wait. It's the people who matter now. Tyrion inclined his head in agreement, a rare glint of satisfaction in his eyes. "I'll see it done, Your Grace." Jon walked with Daenerys through the corridors, if they could still be called that, where partial ceilings remained overhead. Piles of chipped stone littered what had once been a sumptuous marble floor. In corners, upturned furniture lay rotting, infested with insects. Daenerys felt memories crowd in. She had once stood in that great hall after the war with Cersei, triumphant, but hollow inside. The space had seen chaos, the aftermath of her dragon's wrath. Now it was a quiet ruin, gradually being cleared by patient hands. Perhaps that was a metaphor for her own state, burdened by old, destructive passions, but working to rebuild something better. They reached a courtyard where a new floor of wooden planks had been laid over the rubble. Beyond it stood a set of broad steps that led to what remained of the royal apartments. A handful of her loyal Dothraki, those who had survived the long night, were already posted as guards, scanning the area with hawkish vigilance. They bowed their heads as Daenerys passed, calling her Khaleesi in soft, respectful voices. It had been so long since she had marched with the full might of the Khalasar. Most of them had perished in the war against the dead. Her heart clenched at the memory. Inside, the apartments Tyrion had mentioned turned out to be a small suite of rooms that had once formed part of a larger royal wing. Now that wing had caved in. Workers had cleared the rubble from these 3 adjoining chambers, shoring up the cracked ceiling with thick beams. Not exactly the regal splendor one associated with a queen's quarters, but it was private and, most importantly, safe. The walls showed scorching in places, the windows were missing glass, replaced by wooden shutters, and the furniture was an odd assortment of salvaged chairs and tables. But it was enough. Jon watched Daenerys walk the perimeter of the main room, trailing her fingertips over the blackened stones. Dust clung to her glove, and she paused near a large hole in the wall, once a window, perhaps, through which the city was visible. The sprawl of King's Landing extended outward, a patchwork of partial rooftops, scaffolding, and narrow streets. In some districts, colored awnings had reappeared, suggesting merchants resuming their trade. Smoke rose from cook fires, and the faint, mingled hum of thousands of voices reached her ears. She turned to Jon. "I left this city in ruin, chasing after a threat beyond all comprehension," she said, her voice hushed. "Some part of me thought I might never return, that the Night King might end everything." She swallowed. "Now I have to face what I did and what I can do now. Even if they fear me, I must try to make it right." Jon approached her, setting a hand gently on her shoulder. "People will judge you by your deeds from this point on. The city still stands, and you've come not with fire and blood, but with open hands, just as we've done in the villages. In time, they'll see that." She squeezed his hand in silent gratitude. A staffer soon appeared, a young woman in simple attire, stammering that she was assigned to assist the queen. Daenerys offered a calm smile and asked for a basin of water and cloth so she could refresh herself. Jon departed to inspect the rest of the keep and consult with Grey Worm regarding security. She needed a moment to settle her own thoughts. Once the staffer delivered the basin, Daenerys washed away the dust and grime of the road, peering at her reflection in the water's surface. She saw the faint shadows under her eyes, the scar on her shoulder that still throbbed sometimes in cold weather. The scar had been inflicted by the Night King's blade. The flesh had healed, but the memory remained. Yet another reminder that her path had not been easy. A few hours later, Daenerys emerged to join Tyrion, Davos, and Jon on a walk through the city streets. They took only a minimal guard, trusting that the people needed to see her as accessible, not hidden behind a phalanx of spears. The dragons remained perched near the Red Keep, drawing stares from half a city away. Even from the main thoroughfare, one could glimpse Drogon's black silhouette atop the half-fallen ramparts. Rhaegal perched close by, both beasts warily observing this old battleground. Daenerys walked with measured steps, scanning the faces of passers-by. Children peeked around corners, eyes huge. Shopkeepers paused in the middle of hawking wares. Clay pots, fresh fish from Blackwater Bay, rough woven cloth, while older men nodded grudgingly. Some quickly ducked aside, as if unsure how the queen would react to them. The tension was tangible, but so was curiosity. Word must have spread that Daenerys Targaryen had returned, that she was distributing food, that she had ended the undead threat. She paused at a small square where a statue of some old Targaryen king had once stood, now broken at the base. His head was missing, lost in the rubble of war. Workers cleared the debris, piling it in carts. A young boy who had been rummaging for salvage froze when he saw Daenerys. For a moment, he stared at her silver hair, recognition dawning. He scrambled away, then paused, looking over his shoulder with a mixture of fascination and fear. Daenerys gave him the barest nod, hoping to convey that he need not run. He lingered, half hidden behind the cart, watching her every move. Gradually, a few citizens summoned the nerve to approach. Some asked if the queen would end the food rationing, if she would open the granaries so fewer children went hungry. Others muttered about repairs to the city's main aqueduct, which had cracked during the war. Daenerys and Tyrion explained that shipments of grain would be coming from the Reach, from House Tarly and other lords who had pledged to help feed the capital. Rebuilding the aqueduct was already on her list of priorities. Her words were met with cautious acceptance. Promises had been made by monarchs before, after all, but at least no one spat or threw stones. A man with a ragged, burned face confronted her near a collapsed tavern. He refused to bow, demanded in a shaking voice to know why her dragons had scorched half the district. Tyrion moved to intervene, but Daenerys held up a hand. She let the man vent his anger. He raged about the day the bells rang, how his sister had died in a burning house that had once served as a simple bakery. Daenerys met his eyes, unable to stave off the weight of guilt. "I cannot bring her back," Daenerys said quietly, her voice carrying a tremor of regret. "I can only vow to use my power for the living. I'll do what I can to ensure you and others can rebuild better homes. If you need a place to stay or a livelihood, come to the Red Keep tomorrow. Ask for a steward named Willis. He'll help you register for rebuilding funds." The man spat on the ground, but not at her. He stared a moment longer, tears brimming in eyes half hidden by burned scars, then turned away. "Words," he mumbled. "Just words." But she saw that he had not swung a fist or lunged with a weapon, and some of the anger in his gaze had yielded to a pained, haunted emptiness. Jon laid a hand on Daenerys's arm, steadying her as she sighed. This was the first of many such confrontations, she knew. The path to forgiveness, if it was even possible, would be long. Tyrion muttered that they should move on, quietly reminding her that rations were set to be distributed at the city's southern gate. He suggested they go show the people her direct involvement in that process. Daenerys nodded, forcing her feet to continue. Over the ensuing days, she moved throughout King's Landing, accompanied by a small retinue that included Tyrion, Davos, Grey Worm, and occasionally Jon, though he sometimes split off to manage security or speak with northern soldiers. They inspected the half-rebuilt harbor along the Blackwater, where ships trickled in with lumber and supplies. They toured the ruin of the Great September's remains, now a field of rubble, overgrown with weeds and stray cats. Some suggested building a new center of worship, perhaps smaller but symbolic of the realm's renewal. Daenerys left that decision to the city's faithful, encouraging them to convene a council of septons to plan it themselves. She helped organize official ration stations in 3 major districts, pulling from the new stores arriving from the Reach, which had begun to recover more quickly thanks to minimal damage there. Every day, people lined up for bread, fresh water, and occasional salt fish. The lines stretched on, but the promise of food without violence or extortion slowly thawed a portion of the citizens' distrust. Soldiers of the City Watch, overseen by Davos and Tyrion, tried to maintain order without harshness. Scuffles broke out occasionally, but no major riots. A faint spark of hope glimmered in the air. If the Dragon Queen truly meant to feed them rather than burn them, perhaps there was a future here after all. With each passing week, more shipments arrived. The combined presence of Jon's northern men and Daenerys's unsullied lent an air of stability to the city. When desperate criminals tested that stability, the response was swift but measured. Arrests, punishments that aimed at deterrence rather than cruelty. Grey Worm in particular struggled to find a balance. In Essos, the Unsullied's approach to criminals had been more unforgiving. But Daenerys insisted on a more nuanced approach, wanting to demonstrate that her rule was not built on terror. Grey Worm, out of loyalty, complied. Over time, he seemed to come to terms with a world not defined solely by war. Inside the Red Keep, the half-collapsed throne room remained mostly cordoned off. Workers had cleared some of the debris, revealing partial arches and shattered columns. The Iron Throne, which had once stood as a looming symbol of Targaryen conquest, lay twisted under collapsed masonry. Some whispered that it was an omen, that perhaps the throne was no longer fit for a new era. Others suggested forging a new throne from scratch. Daenerys herself rarely ventured there, uncertain how she felt about that seat of power which had driven so many to madness, including, at times, herself. Instead, she held court in a smaller, repaired courtyard near the keep's eastern side. An awning provided shelter, and a dais of plain wooden boards served as her seat, a simple carved chair behind a sturdy table. Each morning, a line formed as petitioners brought disputes and requests. Land titles had to be reassigned. Families separated by war sought the means to reunite. Merchants pleaded for reduced tolls. Tyrion flanked Daenerys, offering advice in whispers. Davos stood behind them, calmly interjecting a voice of reason when tempers flared. Jon was often present but sometimes delegated the day-to-day judgments to Daenerys and Tyrion, preferring to oversee reconstruction efforts around the city's outskirts. Though Daenerys sometimes felt the tension coiling in her chest, especially when confronted with reminders of her past destruction, she pressed on. Each petition granted, each measure of justice dispensed, chipped away at the city's fear. She never turned away complaints about the war. If someone came raging about lost family, lost homes, she heard them out. She did not offer glib excuses. She could only acknowledge the horror and promise to guide the realm in a better direction. Some left spitting curses. Others left with tears but the barest flicker of relief that at least the queen had listened. Gradually, more lords and envoys from other regions of Westeros began arriving, drawn by news that the capital was stirring back to life. Gendry Baratheon came from the Stormlands, pledging shipments of timber for the city's rebuilding. The newly organized House Tarly delegates brought grain and fruit from the Reach, expressing a desire to bury old grudges. A few Ironborn captains showed up, carefully, with trade goods from the Iron Islands, still suspicious but eager to turn a profit in the city's new markets. Daenerys received each with measured courtesy, explaining the Great Council's intended structure, how the realm would share resources, how a new age of cooperation might prevent further devastation. She also oversaw the reorganization of the City Watch. Many of its old members had died or deserted during the final war. In their place, loyal men from various backgrounds were trained under Grey Worm's strict discipline, though Daenerys insisted the training focus not merely on combat but also on dealing humanely with the citizenry. To set an example, she had 2 watchmen punished for beating a suspect unprovoked. In the past, such things might have been overlooked. Not in the CI. She hoped to rebuild. Meanwhile, Jon worked tirelessly in the background. He coordinated the distribution of building materials to the poor districts, personally visited sites where collapsed tenements stood to ensure workers had the resources needed to clear debris. He even helped raise a few new frames for a small block of housing near Flea Bottom. The local residents at first had no idea he was the man once called the King in the North. They only saw a quiet fellow in a heavy cloak, hauling beams and overseeing construction. When they learned who he was, some joked that perhaps the best kings were the ones who built houses rather than burned them. Jon took it in stride, only shrugging off the praise. Davos joined him most days, the two forging an easy camaraderie that had once blossomed in the battles against the dead. Together, they found local skilled masons and carpenters, paying them fair wages from the crown's coffers. In public squares, Jon explained that this was all part of Daenerys Targaryen's vow to restore the city, not just rule it. The name Dragon Queen no longer evoked quite the same fear when attached to stories of free bread lines and new wooden roofs. Though the city still carried the memory of scorching fire, small seeds of trust began to take root. Amid these hectic routines, Daenerys and Jon carved out moments of private respite. Sometimes, late at night, they walked along the battlements of the keep, hearing the distant hum of the city below. The air was warmer than in the north, laced with the salt tang of the bay. They spoke softly about the future of the realm, about how to handle challenges that would surely arise once the Great Council formalized its structure. There was an unspoken tension about Jon's parentage, especially among those lords who recalled the revelation that he was of Targaryen blood. Yet he and Daenerys had quietly agreed not to thrust that matter into the forefront. The people needed stability, not another succession crisis. Jon made no claim, and Daenerys did not press him to do so. Instead, they presented a united front, a pair who had faced the darkest threat imaginable and emerged devoted to forging peace. Occasionally, a curious lord or lady would inquire about their personal relationship. Would they wed? Merge bloodlines in a formal sense? Daenerys' standard reply was that the realm's reconstruction took priority over any talk of royal weddings. Many accepted that answer, though the whispers continued. As the moons passed, King's Landing bloomed further. Markets sprang up along the main roads. The city's outer gates saw a steady flow of traders. And though plenty of the city's scars remained charred remnants, collapsed blocks of stone, fewer of the people looked upon Daenerys with naked dread. She had not undone the tragedy of that fateful day, but she was proving, day by day, that she would not be that same merciless queen again. One afternoon, as Daenerys sat in the courtyard hearing petitions, Tyrion leaned close to whisper that an envoy from Dorne awaited an audience. She raised an eyebrow, remembering that Dorne had become isolated after the death of Prince Doran and his heirs during Cersei's ascent. Rumor held that a distant Martell cousin had claimed a leadership role. Thus far, Dorne had kept mostly to itself, watching from afar as the rest of Westeros tore itself apart. If an envoy was here, it suggested a willingness to reconnect. "Send them in," Daenerys said. She gestured for the next petitioners to step aside momentarily. A hush fell over the courtyard. Tyrion signaled to the guards, and soon two figures stepped forward. One wore the loose robes and sandals typical of Dornish nobility, and the other, presumably his guard, had a curved scimitar at his waist. The nobleman was a man of middling years, tanned skin, and a carefully trimmed mustache. He bowed low. "Your Grace," he began, his accent clipped with Dornish melody. "I am Lord Corran Hill, emissary of the new ruling council in Sunspear. We greet you on behalf of House Martell's lineage and the free lords of Dorne." Daenerys beckoned him to rise, offering a courteous nod. "Well met, Lord Corran Hill. The realm has missed Dorne's presence. I trust you've traveled safely?" He acknowledged her with a reserved smile. "We have. The roads are clearer than we expected, though we heard tales of your generosity toward villages. It seems we have come at an auspicious time. Dorne wishes to discuss matters of mutual interest, trade across the Sea of Dorne, the possibility of representation in your great council, and ensuring the security of our borders." Daenerys listened carefully, then glanced at Tyrion. "Lord Tyrion, see to it that Lord Corran and his men are given suitable quarters. We will host them properly this evening and discuss these matters in detail." Corran inclined his head again. "Dorne thanks you. We look forward to this new age under your leadership, one that values each region's distinct freedoms." There was a subtle emphasis on the word freedoms, as if reminding her that Dorne had never easily bowed to kings and queens. Nevertheless, his manner suggested a willingness to negotiate peacefully. Daenerys assured him she recognized Dorne's proud history and would incorporate their unique perspective in the realm's governance. The envoy departed with a polite bow. Tyrion murmured once the Dornishman had gone. "Another piece of the puzzle. If Dorne fully rejoins the realm, their resources and trade will strengthen the crown significantly. But they'll want concessions. Likely some form of guaranteed autonomy." Daenerys rubbed the back of her neck, feeling the day's heat settling on her shoulders. "I have no wish to strong-arm them. If an accord can be reached that keeps us united in preventing future wars, I'll sign it." Tyrion gave her a small smile. "That is the type of compromise that will keep this realm from tearing itself apart." The swirl of politics continued in that vein. Envoys from the Vale, petitioners from the Stormlands, and cautious words from the Iron Islands. And all the while, the city kept rebuilding. The aqueduct repairs progressed, bringing fresh water into more neighborhoods. Seeds distributed earlier blossomed into new gardens behind small houses, where cabbage, onions, and herbs grew in rough patches of soil. Merchants reopened warehouses near the docks, rebuilding the shipping lanes that had once made King's Landing a thriving hub. Weeks turned into a couple of months, and the transformation of King's Landing became undeniable. Certainly, it still bore horrific scars, but the people no longer cowered at the sight of Targaryen banners. Children ran in the alleys, unafraid of dragons overhead, because they had seen that these dragons delivered no fresh wave of fire. Daenerys took quiet pride in each sign of normalcy. She had come to realize that the only sure path to redemption was to meet people's needs and show them through her deeds that she was a queen they could trust. Amid these efforts, word arrived that the great council she had envisioned was ready to convene in the capital. Lords from across Westeros, northerners, southerners, river lords, and hill chieftains were on the roads, heading for King's Landing in a grand assembly unlike any in living memory. They came not to wage war, but to debate the shape of the realm's future. Sansa Stark would remain in Winterfell as caretaker of the North, but she was sending delegates along with Arya, who had decided to join out of curiosity. Brienne of Tarth escorted them. From the Riverlands, Edmure Tully was rumored to be traveling. The houses of the Reach, under House Tarly's new leadership, had pledged attendance. Gendry Baratheon represented the Stormlands. Dorne, of course, would attend. Even a few from the Iron Islands. Arranging lodging for so many was a logistical challenge in a partially ruined city. Yet the city's population had diminished considerably from its pre-war numbers, and some of the vacant squares had been converted into tent compounds. Taverns that had survived opened their doors, quickly filling with foreign guests. Daenerys hoped that by living in the same city, these lords might see each other's humanity, share meals, engage in conversation, perhaps even bond over the shared trials they had endured. She knew it was an idealistic hope, but after everything, she believed it was worth trying. On the appointed day of the council's opening session, Daenerys rose early. She bathed and dressed in a gown that blended Targaryen black with hints of Dornish and northern fashions, a symbolic gesture of unity. A simple silver chain around her neck bore a three-headed dragon sigil, but no elaborate crown. She still hesitated to don such a symbol, feeling it might antagonize some lords who feared an absolute monarchy. Instead, she would stand as their queen by deed, not just regalia. Jon greeted her outside the temporary council chamber, formerly a large courtyard overshadowed by stone arches that had once formed part of a stable complex. Workers had cleared the rubble and erected wooden bleachers, arranged in a semicircle. Tarps had been strung overhead to provide shade. Banners from across Westeros fluttered in the breeze. The direwolf of Stark, the stag of Baratheon, the rose of Tyrell, though now under Tarly's stewardship, the sun and spear of Martell, and many others. Daenerys's red and black dragon standard was raised as well, but not in a dominating fashion, merely one banner among many. Jon stood in plain leathers, his sword Longclaw at his hip, the thick fur collar of his cloak reminiscent of his northern heritage. He nodded in greeting, and Daenerys saw the subtle lines of strain around his eyes. He too grasped the importance of this day. Together, they entered the courtyard, flanked by Tyrion, Davos, and Grey Worm. The latter had volunteered to keep watch on the perimeter rather than speak at the council. He was no politician, and he knew it. Inside, the gathered lords and delegates rose to their feet, or at least most did, in a show of respect. The hum of conversation died down. A hush spread among the crowd as Daenerys stepped to a simple wooden platform set at the center of the semicircle. She turned in a slow arc, meeting the eyes of those assembled. Fierce northerners in heavy cloaks, elegant Reach lords in embroidered doublets, stern Ironborn in salt-stained leathers, cautious Dornish envoys in bright robes. She recognized many faces from earlier negotiations, but some were new. At the edges, Arya Stark stood near Brienne, scanning the crowd with keen eyes. Gendry Baratheon lifted a hand in greeting from across the courtyard. Edmure Tully offered a slight bow from a seat near the front. Daenerys took a breath, remembering all that had led to this moment. Her exile in Essos, her campaign to free slaves, her triumphant arrival in Westeros, the bitter war with Cersei, the dreadful night battling the dead, and the months of healing work here in King's Landing. She was not the naive queen she once was. She had felt both the heights of victory and the depths of loss. Lords and ladies of Westeros, Daenerys began, her voice carrying, clear but not strident. You have gathered here in King's Landing to shape the future of our realm. For too long we have bled in wars, wars over thrones, over old grudges, over petty ambitions. We stood on the brink of annihilation when the dead walked our lands, and only through unity did we prevail. Now that the Night King is no more, we face a different challenge. Building a realm that will not tear itself apart, that will not invite further devastation. She paused, letting her gaze sweep the assembly. I stand before you as Daenerys Targaryen, once called the Breaker of Chains, and now Queen of the Seven Kingdoms. Yet I do not want to rule by fear. Many of you know I have made mistakes, grave ones that cost innocent lives. I cannot undo the past, but I can shape what comes next. I ask you, as leaders of your regions, to help me forge a realm where power is balanced by cooperation, where no single voice can plunge us into chaos. Tyrion stepped forward to explain the proposed structure of the Great Council, a body of representatives from each region, meeting regularly to decide matters of taxes, justice, trade, and matters of war or peace. The crown would retain a guiding hand, but it would be checked by the council's collective will. Lords listened, some nodding, others whispering in hushed tones to their neighbors. A few, like an older lord from the Westerlands, raised objections, wanting clarity on how seats would be assigned. Tyrion fielded these questions, ever the diplomat, clarifying that each major region would select its own representative. Minor houses might collectively choose a delegate to speak on their behalf. The specifics were flexible, as each region had its customs, but the principle remained. No region would stand voiceless. Jon spoke as well, reminding them of how fragile the realm had been without unity, how close they had come to total destruction. "We're here to ensure that never happens again," he said. "We have a chance to rebuild better, fairer. You all saw the wars for the throne. You saw the dead. Let's not forget the cost." A flurry of discussion followed. Some lords pressed for more autonomy, especially the North and Dorne, citing their unique histories. Others insisted that a strong central monarchy was still needed to keep the peace. Daenerys listened, occasionally interjecting to clarify her vision. The monarchy as a unifying symbol, not an absolute tyrant. Over the next few hours, these debates sprawled in all directions. Quarrels erupted over old land disputes. Sansa's delegate, an older Stark bannerman, strongly emphasized the North's right to self-rule. Gendry Baratheon urged fairness in shipping tariffs. Dornish envoys repeated their request for near independence, while still acknowledging the need for mutual defense. Through it all, Daenerys remained patient, remembering that no single session of words would resolve centuries of tension. But the fact that these lords spoke in a forum, not on the battlefield, represented tremendous progress. She recalled a saying from across the narrow sea, "Better 1,000 words than a single sword stroke," so she let the words flow. By midday, a recess was called, allowing delegates to refresh themselves. Daenerys mingled with them in smaller groups, emphasizing her willingness to compromise. Arya Stark took the opportunity to slip over and greet Daenerys with a polite dip of her head. The younger woman regarded the queen with cool curiosity, as always. "Seems you've made quite a change here in King's Landing," Arya observed, scanning the half-rebuilt walls. "Not the ruin I remember." Daenerys gave a careful smile. "I wish it had never been ruined at all. But yes, we're rebuilding. And it's thanks in part to the North supplies in these recent months. I appreciate your sister sending them." Arya nodded, watching Daenerys closely, as though measuring how sincere the queen's regret was. "We all saw how you fought the dead," Arya said simply. "That matters. I won't pretend I've forgotten old grievances, but I'll admit you've done more good than I expected, especially after everything." Daenerys inclined her head in a modest acknowledgement. She had come to respect Arya's bluntness, even if it could be disconcerting. "Thank you," she said softly. "I'll continue earning the North's trust however I can." Arya left it at that, heading off to speak with her traveling companions. Daenerys turned her attention to another cluster of lords. So the day wore on, a swirl of negotiations that blended old grudges with new hopes. That evening, they reconvened in the torchlit courtyard. This time, the lords agreed on a foundational charter for the Great Council. Each region would have a seat, with additional seats for clusters of minor houses that might otherwise go unheard. The monarchy, in Daenerys' person, retained ultimate authority in times of immediate crisis, but all non-emergency edicts required consultation with the council. Furthermore, the council could veto any measure deemed harmful to the realm's common welfare, though the threshold for such a veto was set high. It was, in essence, a constitutional monarchy of sorts, unheard of in Westeros until now. The final details continued to be hammered out well into the night. By the time the session ended, many lords were bleary-eyed, but a cautious consensus had emerged. They would ratify the new structure in a formal ceremony once the documents were transcribed and the seals affixed. The plan was to hold that ceremony in a rebuilt portion of the Red Keep as a symbolic gesture, the old seat of power giving birth to a new system. When the discussions adjourned, Daenerys leaned against a scorched pillar, exhaustion tugging at her. Jon, approaching with 2 cups of watered wine, offered her one. She accepted it gratefully. The courtyard buzzed with lords filtering out, some in heated talk. Tyrion was cornered by a trio of Reach delegates peppering him with more questions. Arya lingered at the edges, her expression unreadable. Gendry was on the opposite side, speaking in low tones to a pair of Stormland knights. Daenerys sipped the wine, letting the coolness soothe her throat. "It's a beginning," she murmured half to Jon. "Not a perfect system, but better than tyranny or endless war." Jon studied her face. "It's a major step forward. If we stick to it, if the lords abide by it, we might finally have peace. And if a crisis arises, we meet it together." She exhaled slowly. "I only hope they can see that unity is in their best interests. The dead taught us that life is fragile. We should not waste it on petty disputes." Jon set a hand on her shoulder. "The realm has never had a leader who has seen what you have seen. The memory of that will guide your decisions, and hopefully guide them too." In the weeks that followed, the Great Council hammered out final details. Scribes worked endlessly, penning copies of the new charter. Each major lord appended his seal. Even the Ironborn delegate, after lengthy grumbling, signed on, receiving assurances that the Iron Islands could maintain certain autonomies. The Dornish envoy did the same, albeit with a flourish of independence in mind. The Stark representative placed the direwolf seal with a solemn vow to hold the North in good faith. At last, the day of the formal signing arrived. Under the half-rebuilt ceiling of the Red Keep's old library, one of the least damaged wings, the lords gathered. A large table had been set up, bearing the official parchment. Daenerys stood at the head of the table, flanked by Tyrion and Davos. Jon hovered near her, arms folded, as the delegates filed in, each in turn pressing seal or signature to the parchment. The hush in the room felt electric. It reminded Daenerys of the hush before battle, though this was a battle of quills rather than swords. When the last lord stepped forward to sign, an aged knight from the Westerlands who had once served House Lannister, a soft murmur of relief spread through the assembled. Daenerys took a quill next, carefully writing her name, Daenerys of House Targaryen, then affixing the Targaryen seal. She straightened, setting the quill aside. The document was complete. A new system of governance for Westeros, one that might, if nurtured, prevent the realm from devouring itself again. The watchers erupted in quiet applause, some seeming genuinely moved by the moment, others simply relieved that the negotiations were finished. Daenerys allowed herself a small smile. She could almost sense a weight lifting from her shoulders. This was the end of challenges, far from it. But it was a statement. Westeros had survived the long night and was now binding itself together in a way that might stand for generations. Outside, in the keep's courtyard, people gathered to celebrate. The city's population, hearing that a monumental agreement had been reached, thronged near the gates, curious about what new edict might shape their lives. Jon organized a modest feast, enough fresh bread, roasted meats, and ale to share with the city's laborers. They set up long tables under the open sky, letting lords and commoners mingle. The lines between them were still visible, but the atmosphere was hopeful. Daenerys walked among the tables, occasionally stopping to speak with a family or a group of laborers. She expressed thanks for their patience and pledged to continue working on the city's repairs. Some bowed respectfully, others merely nodded. But the suspicion once so palpable in King's Landing had eased significantly. The memory of her dragons scorching the streets could not vanish, but the daily proof of her compassion had begun to overshadow that horror. She recognized that true forgiveness would take longer, perhaps a generation. But there was progress. As the sun dipped below the battered walls, torches were lit, and a gentle music drifted through the courtyard. A few traveling minstrels braving the city to earn coin. The notes of a lute and fiddle wove between the clusters of celebrants. Lords in fine cloaks stood alongside soldiers and merchants, sampling ale from the same casks. The swirl of color and sound put Daenerys in mind of festivals she had witnessed in Essos, albeit on a smaller scale. Jon found her near a brazier, where she had paused to warm her hands. "Quite a sight," he said quietly, gazing over the gathering. "Not so long ago, these streets saw blood and fire. Now people stand together, talking, laughing." Daenerys nodded. "It's more than I ever dreamed I'd see here again," she admitted. "If this unity holds." "It will," Jon interrupted gently. "We'll make sure of it." He hesitated, then added, "Many lords are asking about the future, our future, whether you and I plan to marry, officially. They say it might solidify the realm's unity if the Queen and I were joined." She regarded him, measuring his expression. The question of marriage had hung between them for many months, unspoken but inevitable. They cared for each other deeply, that much was clear, and they had faced unimaginable horrors side by side. Yet marriage carried symbolic weight in Westeros, especially with both of them being Targaryen by blood, however complicated that might be. Daenerys let out a slow breath. "You have no desire for a crown," she said gently. Jon shook his head, eyes somber. "No, but if it helps keep the realm stable, if it helps you, I'm not opposed. That is, if you wish it." Daenerys's heart pounded a little faster. She turned, letting her gaze sweep the courtyard. The lines of tired but hopeful faces, the flickering torches illuminating the half-ruined keep. She recalled how they had once stood in the bitter cold of the north, uncertain if they would even survive the night. Now here they were, forging a new era. Would marriage be one more step toward binding the realm's wounds, or would it raise questions about Targaryen bloodlines again? She reached for Jon's hand, intertwining her fingers with his. "I'm not sure I want to make that decision because of politics," she said softly, holding his gaze. "I care about you, truly. I've come to rely on you in ways I never thought possible. But I also want to ensure that if we take that step, it's for us, not just for them." Jon's eyes warmed at her words. He lifted her hand to his lips, brushing a light kiss across her knuckles. "Then let's not rush," he agreed. "The realm is stable under this new council. We can let them murmur and wonder. If the time feels right, we'll make it known. And if not, my loyalty is yours, whatever the titles say." Daenerys felt a swell of gratitude, along with the gentle ache of love. She squeezed his hand in response. "That's all I need to hear," she said. For now, the realm's well-being overshadowed everything else. They spent the rest of the evening mingling with the crowd. Tyrion gave a brief speech, toasting the new order, weaving humor and earnestness into a short address that drew both laughter and polite applause. Davos clapped him on the shoulder, remarking that it was the first time in ages the city had heard a speech without fear of condemnation or violence. Arya stood near a pillar, half smiling at the minstrel's attempts at music. Gendry teased her about dancing, only to receive a playful elbow in the ribs. Night deepened, stars emerging over the battered skyline. The flicker of lanterns and torches cast warm pools of light across the courtyard. Daenerys glanced upward, thinking of how once she had imagined King's Landing as a place of final triumph. She had pictured herself seated on the Iron Throne in a blaze of glory, the last Targaryen conquering the city of her forefathers. Now, that dream felt distant, childish in a way. She had claimed the city, yes, but the real victory was in forging a community with those who once feared her. She no longer needed the throne's twisted swords to validate her rule. She had found a deeper sense of purpose, ensuring that the living could thrive, free from the horrors that once stalked Westeros. Close to midnight, the gathering began to dwindle as delegates returned to lodgings or local inns. Daenerys, feeling exhaustion in her bones, made her way back through the keep's ruined corridors to her chambers. Jon accompanied her, silent comfort in his presence. Outside the chamber, two Unsullied stood guard, saluting as Daenerys and Jon approached. She waved them off politely, entering the suite. The single lantern inside cast dancing shadows on the soot-stained walls. She set aside her cloak, glancing over the small writing desk piled with scrolls requiring her attention. Petitions, supply requests, updates from Sansa in the north. Tomorrow would bring more work. But tonight, just for a moment, she let herself breathe. She heard Jon shut the door behind them, his footsteps echoing on the wooden planks. Wordlessly, they sank into each other's embrace, the tension of the day melting away. She felt his warmth against her, the gentle brush of his calloused fingers on her back. Her mind drifted to the times they had shared closeness like this, stolen moments in Winterfell, fervent embraces during the war when death loomed. Now the threat was not an undead army, but the long labor of peace. Still, there was solace in having a partner who understood that burden. They parted after a moment, exchanging a soft look. Jon lifted a hand to caress her cheek. "Tomorrow it begins in earnest," he said quietly. "This council, this new era. Are you ready?" Daenerys managed a weary smile. "I have to be," she replied. "I chose this path. I won't fail them." "You won't," Jon said simply. She believed him, or at least she believed in the unity they were forging. The mistakes of the past, the bloodshed, and the Night King's horror had all led them here, forging a cautionary tale that no one wanted to repeat. In that sense, the dead had imparted a lesson to the living: stand together or perish. Daenerys moved to the narrow window, gazing out at the silhouettes of her dragons perched atop the keep's remnants. Drogon's bulk loomed in the moonlight, tail flicking restlessly. Rhaegal lay curled nearby, quieter, watchful. They too had changed. Once instruments of conquest, now guardians of a realm seeking peace. She wondered briefly if they missed the open skies of Essos or the icy expanse of the north. But they remained here, bonded to her, watching over the city she was determined to protect. Exhaling, Daenerys turned away from the window. She beckoned Jon closer, and he came. In the flickering lanternlight, they found a quiet intimacy, unspoken but full of trust and shared resolve. For tonight, at least, they could rest in each other's arms, allowing hope to buoy them above the regrets and the challenges still to come. And in the city below, men and women drifted to sleep under patched roofs, bellies less empty than before, hearts lighter with the promise of a gentler dawn. The memories of war, both old and recent, lingered in every scarred street, but so did the signs of rebirth. Clean water flowing in new channels, seeds sprouting in courtyard gardens, children laughing instead of crying. The hush of kings landing at night was no longer haunted by the hiss of flames or the screams of terror. It was, instead, filled with the soft breathing of thousands who dared to believe in tomorrow. So the new day would come, and with it, the long work of binding wounds. Daenerys Targaryen, breaker of chains, would rise to meet it, not alone, but with allies, with the man she loved, and with a realm that, for the first time in a generation, might find unity in its shared humanity. And in that unity, a fragile but luminous hope burned brighter than dragonfire, illuminating the path forward across a land that had learned, at unimaginable cost, the value of life and peace.